The morning air hung thick with the scent of predator musk and old blood as Lyra pushed open the heavy iron gate to Shadowfang's enclosure. The ancient dire wolf lay sprawled across the stone floor like a fallen mountain, his massive frame rising and falling with each laboured breath. 3 handlers had died trying to tend his infected wound. The 4th had refused to even approach the cage. But Lyra wasn't afraid. She never had been, and that should have been her first clue that something was different about her. Normal people didn't walk into the lair of a creature that could snap a man's spine with one bite. Normal people didn't hum lullabies while cleaning the festering wounds of shadow bears or changing the bloodied straw beneath war panthers who'd torn apart seasoned warriors. Normal people had survival instincts. Lyra apparently had been born without them. "Easy, beautiful," she murmured, settling cross-legged beside the massive wolf's head. Shadowfang's yellow eyes cracked open, fixing on her with an intelligence that sometimes made her wonder if he understood every word she spoke. "I know it hurts. Let me help." The dire wolf's ears twitched, but he made no move to snap at her as she unpacked her simple medical supplies. A bowl of warm water stolen from the kitchen before dawn, clean rags she'd bartered for with her meal portions, and a precious vial of healing salve that Elder Thorne had grudgingly provided after her persistent begging. "You're going to let me look at that bite, aren't you?" Lyra's fingers found the matted fur around the wound on Shadowfang's shoulder, where another dire wolf had torn deep during a territorial dispute. The flesh was hot and swollen, angry red infections spreading beneath the black fur. "I thought so. You know I'm only trying to help." She began cleaning the wound with gentle strokes, and Shadowfang's massive head settled more comfortably on the stone floor. His breathing deepened, tension leaving muscles that could have crushed her without effort. This was what the other handlers couldn't understand. These creatures weren't mindless monsters driven by bloodlust. They were intelligent, emotional beings who responded to respect and kindness. Not that anyone cared about her observations. To the rest of the castle staff, she was just the crazy girl who volunteered for the death trap assignments, the expendable one who cleaned up the messes no one else would touch. "Beast fodder," she heard Marcus call from outside the enclosure, his voice carrying the casual cruelty she'd grown accustomed to over the years. "How's our walking corpse this morning? Still breathing?" "Barely," came Garrett's reply, followed by harsh laughter. "Give her another week with that monster. Even freaks run out of luck eventually." Lyra's hands didn't pause in their gentle ministrations, though something deep in her chest tightened at their words. She'd learned long ago not to react to the taunts. Showing pain only encouraged them, and she'd endured enough encouragement to last several lifetimes. "They don't know you," she whispered to Shadowfang, whose intelligent eyes remained fixed on her face. "They think you're just a killing machine, but I see you, don't I? I see how carefully you move around me, how you've never once shown me your teeth in anger." The dire wolf made a sound that was almost a whine, pressing his massive snout against her palm. Lyra's breath caught. In 3 years of tending him, Shadowfang had never initiated contact. He tolerated her touch, accepted her care, but he'd never actively sought comfort from her. "What was that for?" she asked softly, running her fingers through the coarse fur between his ears. "Having a sentimental morning?" But even as she joked, something stirred in the back of her mind. A fragment of memory she could never quite grasp, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. A woman's voice, warm and musical, singing about shadows and crowns and creatures who knew the truth when others saw only lies. The crown that waits in shadows deep, where ancient beasts their vigil keep. Where had she heard that song? The melody felt as familiar as her own heartbeat, but every time she tried to focus on the memory, it slipped away like mist. "You're losing your mind, Lyra," she muttered, applying the healing salve to Shadowfang's wound with practiced efficiency. "Talking to wolves and hearing phantom songs, no wonder they think you're touched." She worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, cleaning and treating the wound, while Shadowfang remained perfectly still beneath her hands. The trust he showed her was absolute, and it never failed to humble her. This creature could end her life in an instant, yet he lay vulnerable and patient, allowing her to help him heal. "There," she said finally, sitting back to admire her work. The wound looked much better already, the healing salve drawing out infection and reducing the angry swelling. "That should start feeling better within a few hours, but you need to stop picking fights with the younger wolves. You're not as spry as you used to be." Shadowfang huffed, a sound that seemed almost indignant, and Lyra laughed. The first genuine laugh she'd managed in days, bright and musical, in the stone confines of the enclosure. "Don't give me that attitude. I've seen you limping when you think no one's watching. There's no shame in acknowledging your limitations." She began packing up her supplies, but froze when she heard the commotion from the castle courtyard. Voices raised in excitement, the thunder of hooves on cobblestone, the distinctive sound of a large entourage arriving with fanfare. The Alpha King. Lyra's heart began to race for reasons she couldn't explain. She'd never seen Alpha King Kieran in person, had only heard whispered stories about his power and presence. He was a legend more than a man, the kind of figure who existed in a realm so far above her own that they might as well be different species. But something in her chest pulled tight at the thought of him, a strange anticipation that made no sense. Why should she care about the arrival of someone who would never even know she existed? "Looks like the castle's about to get interesting," she told Shadowfang, who had lifted his great head to listen to the distant sounds. "The bonding ceremony starts tomorrow. All the high-born ladies will be preening and plotting, trying to catch his attention." The dire wolf's ears flattened against his skull, and he made a low sound that wasn't quite a growl. Lyra frowned, studying his expression. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of his moods over the years, and this reaction was new. Not anger exactly, but something like anticipation. "What's got into you?" she asked, but Shadowfang was already rising to his feet, moving to the front of his enclosure with surprising grace for such a massive creature. His yellow eyes were fixed on something beyond the stable walls, his entire body tense with alertness. Throughout the stable, other creatures were stirring. The shadow bears in the adjacent enclosures had risen from their morning rest, pressing against the bars as if straining to see or scent something in the distance. The war panthers paced restlessly, their usual lazy confidence replaced by an electric energy that made the air itself feel charged. "Easy," Lyra murmured, moving between the enclosures with practiced calm, but her own pulse was quickening. In all her years working with these creatures, she'd never seen them react this way to a simple arrival. They were all focused in the same direction, toward the castle proper, as if responding to some signal only they could perceive, as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Lyra shook her head, trying to dismiss the fanciful thought. She was letting the excitement of the other servants affect her imagination. The Alpha King's arrival was certainly significant for the kingdom's political future, but it had nothing to do with her or the creatures in her care. She finished her rounds quickly, checking on the shadow bear's healing claw injuries and ensuring the war panthers had adequate fresh water. But the strange energy persisted, crackling through the air like the moments before a thunderstorm. By the time she'd completed her morning duties, the sun was fully risen, and the sounds from the castle had settled into the organised chaos of major preparations. She should return to her small quarters above the feed storage and try to rest before the afternoon feeding, but something kept her lingering in the stable, something that felt suspiciously like hope. And hope, as she'd learned through years of disappointment and casual cruelty, was the most dangerous emotion of all. Hope suggested that her life could be different, that she might matter to someone, that her strange affinity with dangerous creatures might mean something more than just a useful quirk that kept her employed in the most hazardous job in the castle. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But as she finally turned to leave, Shadowfang's massive head followed her movement, those ancient yellow eyes holding an expression she'd never seen before, as if he knew something she didn't, as if he was waiting for her to understand a truth that hovered just beyond her grasp. The crown that waits in shadows deep where ancient beasts their vigil keep. The song fragment whispered through her mind again, carried on a voice she couldn't place, but would have followed anywhere. And for just a moment, standing in the morning light streaming through the stable windows, with the most dangerous creatures in the kingdom watching her with something that looked almost like reverence, Lyra allowed herself to wonder. What if everything she'd been told about herself was wrong? The restoration of the Northern Crown's regalia had taken place in the castle's most sacred chamber, deep beneath the main structure where ancient stones, hummed with power, accumulated over centuries of royal bloodline ceremonies. Lyra stood before a mirror of polished silver, hardly recognizing the figure reflected there. Gone was every trace of the servant girl who had cleaned beast enclosures and endured casual cruelty from those who believed themselves her betters. In her place stood a queen who commanded attention simply by existing, draped in robes of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and hold starlight within their folds. The restored crown of the northern realm rested on her brow, its sapphires blazing with inner fire that matched the power flowing through her awakened bloodline. But it was the confidence in her bearing that marked the greatest transformation. The hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of servitude had been replaced by the straight spine and direct gaze of someone born to rule. Every movement spoke of authority, every glance carried the weight of ancient royal blood finally allowed to flow freely. "You look as your mother did on her coronation day," Lady Morwen said softly from behind her. Lyra's aunt had arrived with the dawn, leading an army of northern clans, but finding time for this private moment of family recognition. The resemblance between the sisters was striking, though 20 years of mountain warfare had carved Morwen's features into sharper lines than Queen Alara had ever known. "I wish she could see this," Lyra replied, her fingers tracing the intricate metalwork of the crown that had been crafted for her mother's head decades earlier. Both of them. They deserved to know that their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. "They know, child. The dead always know when justice finally comes for their murderers." A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted their reunion. At Lyra's permission, Kieran entered, and the sight of him took her breath away, despite the mate bond that had kept them connected throughout the morning's preparations. He wore the formal robes of his own kingship, midnight blue to match her own, with silver threading that caught the light like captured moonbeams. But it wasn't his magnificent appearance that made her pulse quicken. It was the expression in his dark eyes as he looked upon her, a mixture of awe and fierce pride and love, so deep it seemed to reshape the very air between them. "Your Majesty," he said formally, offering the deep bow appropriate between sovereign equals. But when he straightened, his voice carried intimate warmth meant only for her. "You are magnificent." The mate bond flared between them, golden threads of connection visible even to Lady Morwen, who made a sound of approval low in her throat. "The ancestors chose well. This bond will produce heirs worthy of both bloodlines." Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks, but before she could respond, Elder Thorne appeared in the doorway with the urgency of someone bearing critical news. "Your Majesties, forgive the interruption, but events are moving faster than anticipated. Lady Seraphina has returned." The chamber fell silent except for the soft hiss of intake breath from all present. Lyra's hand moved instinctively to the ancient blade at her side, its metal warm with responsive power. "Returned?" Kieran's voice carried the controlled menace of an alpha wolf protecting his mate. "With what force?" "Alone, Your Majesty. She approaches under a flag of parley, requesting an audience with Queen Lyra." Thorne's weathered face creased with suspicion. "Her message claims she wishes to discuss terms of surrender." Lady Morwen snorted with derision. "Aldrich's daughter doesn't know the meaning of surrender. This is a trap of some kind." "Perhaps," Lyra agreed, studying her reflection one final time before turning away from the mirror. "But sometimes traps can be turned against those who set them. Where does she wait?" "The great hall has been cleared and prepared for formal audiences. Your northern clans hold the perimeter, and Kieran's guard controls the interior approaches. If she attempts treachery, she will not escape. Lyra nodded, feeling the weight of decision settle on her shoulders, like the royal cloak now flowing behind her. This confrontation had been inevitable from the moment she'd claimed her heritage. Seraphina represented everything that had kept her suppressed and hidden for 20 years. Facing her would be the final test of how completely she'd transformed from victim to sovereign. "Then let's not keep our guest waiting." The great hall had been restored to something approaching its former grandeur, though the scars of the previous night's battle would never fully fade. Fresh tapestries covered the worst of the bloodstains, and new furniture replaced what had been destroyed in the fighting. But the atmosphere remained charged with tension, as if the very stones remembered the violence they had witnessed. Lyra entered with the ceremony befitting her station, preceded by the ancient ritual of royal announcement. Her northern guardsmen lined the walls, their mountain-forged weapons gleaming in the afternoon light that streamed through the high windows. At the centre of it all, Shadowfang lay beside the restored throne, his massive presence a reminder that her power extended beyond human political manoeuvring. Lady Seraphina stood in the middle of the hall like a figure from a tragic painting. Her golden hair remained perfect despite her flight from the castle. Her emerald gown showed no signs of hard travel, and her beautiful face maintained its mask of serene confidence. But Lyra's enhanced senses caught the subtle signs of desperation beneath the surface. The slight tremor in her hands, the increased pulse visible at her throat, the scent of fear that no amount of expensive perfume could completely mask. "Your Majesty," Seraphina said, offering a curtsy that was technically perfect, but somehow managed to convey mockery rather than respect. "How lovely you look in my crown." The provocation was obvious, designed to trigger anger and poor judgment. But Lyra had learned restraint in a harder school than any noble finishing academy. "Your crown?" she replied mildly, settling into the throne with the natural grace of someone born to occupy it. "I was under the impression that this belonged to the Northern Crown, which has been mine by right of birth for 23 years. Rights can be disputed, bloodlines can be questioned." Seraphina's green eyes glittered with malice. "Especially when the claimant has spent years living among beasts like a common stable wench." Kieran moved to stand beside the throne, his presence both protective and supportive. The mate bond hummed between them, its golden light visible to everyone present as a manifestation of their unshakable connection. "You seem confused about why you're here," Lyra observed, studying Seraphina's face with the detached interest of a scholar examining an interesting specimen. Elder Thorne mentioned something about surrender. "I come with an offer," Seraphina corrected, her voice taking on the musical quality that had once charmed noble courts. "A way for both of us to avoid the devastation of civil war." "How thoughtful of you to be concerned about devastation, considering your family's role in orchestrating it." Lyra's voice remained pleasant, but steel glinted beneath the silk. "Please, enlighten us." Seraphina stepped forward, her movements calculated to display her beauty to best advantage. Even facing disgrace and exile, she understood the power of her physical appeal. "I propose a trial by combat," she announced, her words carrying clearly through the hall. "Single combat between us, with the victor claiming both throne and mate." Shocked murmurs rippled through the assembled witnesses. The suggestion was bold to the point of madness, but it carried the weight of ancient tradition. Trial by combat was one of the oldest forms of justice, predating modern political systems by millennia. "You would stake everything on single combat?" Kieran asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "After seeing what she did to your father?" Seraphina's perfect smile never wavered. "I have advantages my father lacked, training he never received, and unlike him I'm not burdened by arrogance or the delusion that victory is guaranteed." Lyra studied her carefully, searching for the trap she knew must exist. Seraphina was many things, ambitious, ruthless, politically astute, but she was not suicidal. She wouldn't have proposed this challenge unless she believed she could win. "What makes you so confident?" Lyra asked directly. 20 years of preparation, Seraphina replied, her mask slipping just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. 20 years of training for the possibility that the lost heir might one day return. Did you think my father would leave such an important matter to chance? Understanding began to dawn as Lyra processed the implications. General Aldrich had been a thorough man, one who planned for contingencies others wouldn't even consider. If he had suspected that the heir might have survived, he would have prepared countermeasures. "What did he do to you?" she asked quietly. Seraphina's laugh was like breaking glass. "Enhanced me, made me stronger, faster, more resilient than any normal human. The same alchemical processes used to create the kingdom's elite warriors, refined and perfected over 2 decades of experimentation." The revelation sent ice through Lyra's veins. Alchemical enhancement was possible, though expensive and dangerous. Warriors who underwent the process gained supernatural abilities comparable to those granted by royal bloodlines, but at tremendous physical and mental cost. "You're chemically enhanced," Kieran said, his voice heavy with implications. "That's why you're so confident. You believe artificial enhancements can match awakened royal blood." "I don't believe it," Seraphina corrected, beginning to pace in a circle around the throne. "I know it. I've spent 20 years testing my abilities against every form of supernatural power the kingdom possesses. Werewolves, mages, even captured Northern clan warriors. I have never been defeated." Lyra felt the weight of decision pressing down upon her. Refusing the challenge would be seen as cowardice, would undermine her claim to strength-based leadership. But accepting it meant risking everything she'd just won on the outcome of a single battle against an opponent specifically designed to counter her advantages. Through the mate bond, she felt Kieran's protective instincts warring with his respect for her autonomy. He wanted to fight this battle for her, to shield her from the risk, but he also understood that some challenges could only be met by the person they were directed against. "If I were to accept," Lyra said carefully, "what would be the terms?" "Simple. Ancient tradition. Combat to the death, with no outside interference. The victor claims the throne of the Northern Crown and the right to mate with Alpha King Kieran." Seraphina's eyes glittered with anticipated triumph. "The defeated party's supporters forfeit all claims and withdraw from the conflict." "And if you lose?" "Then I die, and my father's legacy dies with me. The southern duchies abandon their claims, and you rule unopposed." Seraphina's smile was sharp as a blade. "But I won't lose, stable girl. I was born to win this fight." Lyra rose from the throne, feeling the weight of the crown on her brow and the expectations of everyone watching. This was the moment that would define not just her own fate, but the future of the kingdom itself. "I accept your challenge," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. "But when I defeat you, I want your admission of your family's crimes spoken before all witnesses." "Agreed," Seraphina replied instantly. "Though you should know that I've never lost a fight in my life." "Neither have I," Lyra said quietly, her hand moving to the ancient blade at her side. "But then again, until recently, I'd never really had anything worth fighting for." The die was cast. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or disaster, and the fate of 2 kingdoms would be decided by steel and determination in the ancient way. But as the mate bond pulsed with Kieran's unwavering faith in her abilities, as the loyal beasts throughout the castle lifted their voices in harmonious support, Lyra felt something she'd never experienced as a servant. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, facing exactly the challenge she was born to overcome. Victory or death, she would meet it as a queen. 3 weeks had passed since the trial by combat that had shaken the kingdom to its foundations, and Queen Lyra stood on the highest balcony of the castle, surveying lands that were finally, truly hers to protect. The morning sun painted the valley below in shades of gold and amber, illuminating fields where the first honest harvest in 20 years was beginning to ripen. The battle with Seraphina had been as brutal as it was decisive. The alchemically enhanced noblewoman had fought with inhuman speed and strength, her augmented abilities pushing Lyra to the very limits of her royal heritage. For nearly an hour they had traded blows that would have killed ordinary warriors, their enhanced forms moving in a deadly dance that left the arena floor slick with blood from a dozen wounds. But in the end, it had not been raw power that determined the victor. It had been something Seraphina's artificial enhancements could never replicate, the absolute certainty that came from fighting for justice rather than ambition. When Lyra's ancient blade had finally found its mark, piercing the heart that had harboured decades of murderous schemes, Seraphina's last words had been a confession that echoed through the watching crowd. "My father killed your parents for their throne," she had gasped, her enhanced blood pooling beneath her as artificial strength finally failed. "He poisoned them at the peace feast, then spent 20 years hunting for you. I helped him. I wanted the crown that should have been yours." With those words, the last pretense had crumbled. The southern duchies had withdrawn their support within hours, their envoys arriving with formal apologies and pledges of renewed loyalty. The conspiracy that had shaped 2 decades of kingdom politics had been exposed completely, leaving Lyra free to begin the work of true rulership. "Lost in thought again?" Kieran's voice carried the warm affection of a mate secure in his bond as he joined her on the balcony. Even after weeks of public recognition of their connection, the sight of him still made her pulse quicken. The formal robes of ceremony had been replaced by practical leather and wool, but he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had found his perfect match in all things. "Planning," Lyra corrected, accepting the warm cup of morning tea he offered. "Lady Morwen's reports from the northern borders are promising. The mountain clans have agreed to permanent alliance rather than just the emergency support they initially offered." "And the compensation negotiations?" "Progressing well. 20 years of wrongful accusation deserves substantial redress." She sipped the tea gratefully, savouring both its warmth and the domestic comfort of sharing breakfast with her mate. "The clan territories will be expanded to include the mineral rights they were denied, and their warriors will be formally integrated into the kingdom's defence forces." Kieran nodded approvingly. In the weeks since her coronation, he had proven to be not just a devoted mate, but a skilled partner in the complex work of governance. His tactical experience complemented her intuitive understanding of justice, creating a partnership that strengthened both their individual kingdoms and the growing alliance between them. "There's other news," he said, his tone shifting to something that might have been anticipation mixed with concern. "Elder Thorn wishes to speak with you about a matter he calls delicate but urgent. He's waiting in your private study." Lyra raised an eyebrow. Since the revelation of her heritage, Thorn had resumed his role as royal advisor, but their relationship had evolved into something warmer than the distant mentorship of her hidden years. For him to request a formal audience suggested something significant. "Did he give you any indication of the topic?" Kieran's smile held a hint of mischief that made the mate bond flutter with curiosity. "He said it concerned the future of the bloodline." Understanding dawned, bringing heat to her cheeks despite her royal composure. The future of the bloodline could only mean one thing, and the timing aligned with certain changes she had been noticing in her body over the past week. "I see. Then I suppose I shouldn't keep him waiting." Elder Thorn's study had been transformed since the days when it served as a cramped veterinary office behind the stables. Royal artefacts and ancient texts now lined the walls, while maps of the kingdom and its allies covered a table large enough for serious strategic planning. But it was the small collection of delicate instruments on his desk that caught Lyra's attention as she entered. "Your Majesty," Thorn said, rising with the careful movements of age, but the bright eyes of someone energized by important work. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Please, sit. There are questions I need to ask, tests that should be conducted." Lyra settled into the offered chair, her royal training allowing her to maintain composure despite the nervous excitement building in her chest. You believe I'm pregnant. I believe it's possible. The signs have been subtle but consistent over the past week. Enhanced senses report changes in your scent. The castle's beasts have been unusually protective, and there have been other indicators that experienced healers learn to recognize. What kind of tests? Thorn gestured to the instruments on his desk, delicate devices that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. These are artifacts from the old royal line, created specifically to detect the presence of developing heirs. They respond to the unique magical signature that occurs when two royal bloodlines combine. The implication sent a thrill of anticipation through Lyra's system. A child born of her union with Kieran would represent more than just personal happiness. It would be the symbolic and literal union of two ancient kingdoms, the guarantee of peaceful succession, and the promise that the conspiracies that had shaped her early life could never threaten future generations. How do they work? Simple blood magic, a few drops on the primary crystal, and we'll know within minutes. Thorn's weathered face creased with something that might have been grandfatherly excitement. Though I suspect the results will confirm what every creature in this castle has been trying to tell us for days. The test proved Thorn's suspicions correct with dramatic clarity. The moment Lyra's blood touched the ancient crystal, it blazed with golden light that filled the entire study. The other artifacts responded in harmony, creating a symphony of luminescence that spoke of new life growing within the union of two royal lines. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," Thorn said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You carry the heir to both the Northern Crown and the Western Realms." Lyra stared at the blazing artifacts, feeling the truth of their revelation settle into her bones like ancient music. Somewhere deep in her body, a new life was beginning. A child who would grow up knowing their worth from birth, who would never doubt their place in the world or their right to love and be loved in return. How soon before others can detect it? The magical signature is already strong enough that any skilled healer would recognize it. Within another week, the physical signs will be unmistakable to those who know what to look for. Thorn began carefully packing away the artifacts, his movements reverent. "Have you told Kieran?" "Not yet. I wanted to be certain before raising his hopes." Lyra rose from her chair, feeling simultaneously exactly the same as she had that morning, and completely transformed. "But I think he suspects. The mate bond has been different lately, more intense, more protective. That will only increase as the pregnancy progresses. Alpha males become notoriously possessive when their mates carry their young." The thought made her smile, despite the complexities such protectiveness might create. Kieran was already inclined to shield her from political stress and physical danger. Adding pregnancy hormones to the mix might prove challenging for everyone involved. "There's something else we need to discuss," Thorn continued, his tone growing serious. "The timing of this announcement will have significant political implications. An heir born so soon after your coronation will be seen as validation of the mate bond, proof that the union was blessed by higher powers." Lyra nodded, understanding the broader ramifications. "It will also eliminate any remaining questions about succession. A child of two royal bloodlines, conceived in a true mate bond, will have an unassailable claim to both thrones." "Exactly, but it also means that any enemies you have not yet identified will view this pregnancy as their last opportunity to disrupt your rule. The child will be a target from the moment the announcement is made public." The sobering reality tempered her joy, but could not eliminate it entirely. She had spent too many years believing herself worthless, too many months fighting for the right to exist, to let potential threats overshadow the miracle growing within her. "Then we'll protect this child the same way we protected the kingdom," she said firmly, "with truth, with justice, and with the strength that comes from knowing we fight for something larger than ourselves." Thorn's smile was warm with approval. "Your mother would be proud. She faced similar challenges when pregnant with you, and she chose courage over caution then as well." And this child will grow up knowing that legacy, knowing they come from a line of people who chose love over duty, justice over convenience, and hope over fear. Lyra moved toward the door, eager to share the news with Kieran. They will never doubt their worth or their right to happiness. As she left Thorne's study and walked through corridors that had once witnessed her servitude, but now rang with the authority of her footsteps, Lyra felt the weight of the future settling around her like a royal cloak. The child growing within her would inherit 2 kingdoms, but more importantly, they would inherit the knowledge that true power came from protecting those who could not protect themselves. In the distance, she could hear Shadowfang's approving howl, joined by the chorus of creatures who had always recognized her worth. They were calling to their queen, to the future mother of the heir who would unite 2 bloodlines and ensure that the age of hidden royalty and manufactured conflict was truly ended. The broken servant girl who had once believed herself expendable was gone forever, replaced by a queen, a mate, and soon a mother who would shape the future with the same fierce determination that had reclaimed her past. Some transformation, she reflected, as she quickened her pace toward the chambers where Kieran waited, were worth every battle required to achieve them. 6 months had passed since the revelation of her pregnancy, and Queen Lyra stood once again on the castle's highest balcony, but now she gazed upon a kingdom transformed beyond recognition. The autumn harvest spread below her in golden waves, tended by people who worked their own land, rather than toiling under the weight of corrupt taxation. The scars of Aldrich's 20-year reign were healing, replaced by the prosperity that came from honest governance and justice fairly administered. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their child grew strong and healthy. The pregnancy had proceeded exactly as Elder Thorne had predicted, bringing with it an intensification of her connection to both the mate bond and the magical forces that flowed through the kingdom. She could sense the contentment of her people like a warm current in her blood, their happiness feeding back through the ancient ties that bound ruler to realm. "The delegation from the Eastern Kingdoms arrived this morning," Kieran said, joining her as he had every morning since their bonding. His hand found its customary place over hers on her belly, the touch sending familiar warmth through the mate bond. "They're requesting formal alliance treaties now that word of our union has spread beyond our borders." Lyra leaned into his strength, marvelling at how natural this partnership had become. In the months since her coronation, they had discovered that their individual skills complemented each other perfectly. His tactical brilliance and her intuitive understanding of justice created a formidable combination that had already earned respect from neighbouring rulers. "What do they offer in exchange?" "Trade agreements that could double our agricultural exports within 2 years. Their lands are rich in minerals, but poor in farmland, while ours produce more grain than we can use." His voice carried the satisfaction of a ruler whose people would prosper. "It's exactly the kind of mutually beneficial arrangement that builds lasting peace." The irony was not lost on either of them. The political marriage that Seraphina had demanded would have created temporary military alliance at the cost of personal misery. But their genuine mate bond was generating diplomatic opportunities that far exceeded anything mere political convenience could have achieved. "There's other news," Kieran continued, his tone shifting to something warmer. "The mountain clans have sent their formal wedding gift." Lyra turned in his arms, curious. The northern clans had already provided more support than she had dared hope for, integrating their warriors into the kingdom's defences and sharing their ancient knowledge of sustainable farming techniques. "What kind of gift?" "See for yourself." He led her to the opposite side of the balcony, where the view encompassed the castle's rebuilt stable complex. What she saw there made her breath catch with wonder and delight. In the largest paddock, a creature from legend grazed peacefully beside Shadowfang and the other loyal beasts who had become her unofficial royal guard. It was a horse, but like no horse she had ever seen. Its coat shimmered with the deep blue-black of midnight sky, and its mane seemed to capture starlight within its flowing strands. When it lifted its head to look toward the castle, its eyes held the same ancient intelligence she had come to associate with the most powerful magical creatures. "Ah, a Starwind mare," she whispered, recognizing the breed from her mother's stories. "I thought they were extinct." The mountain clans have been protecting a breeding population in their highest valleys for centuries. They're offering her as a mount worthy of the restored northern crown. Kieran's voice held the same awe she felt. "According to Lady Morwyn, this particular mare chose you specifically. She apparently broke free from her handlers the moment they arrived and went directly to the stable where Shadowfang waits." As if summoned by their attention, the magnificent creature lifted her head again and called out in a voice like silver bells. From throughout the stable complex, answering calls rose from every beast under Lyra's protection. It was a song of welcome, of recognition, of creatures acknowledging their sovereign's expanding family. "She's beautiful," Lyra said, tears pricking at her eyes. After so many years of believing herself unworthy of simple kindness, the generosity of her people still overwhelmed her at unexpected moments. "The clans have also sent something for the future prince or princess," Kieran added, producing a small bundle wrapped in mountain silk. "Lady Morwyn insisted I present it personally." Inside the wrapping was a tiny silver pendant, clearly crafted by the same hands that had made the circlet now resting on Lyra's brow. But this piece was designed for an infant, its chain so delicate it seemed spun from moonbeams. At its centre sat a crystal that pulsed with gentle light, warm to the touch and somehow alive with protective magic. It's a guardian stone," Kieran explained, as Lyra held the precious gift. "Infused with blessings from every clan chief and bound with protection spells that have been passed down through generations. As long as our child wears it, they will be shielded from harm by the collective will of the northern people." The contrast with her own childhood could not have been more profound. Where she had worn a pendant designed to hide her identity and suppress her power, their child would bear one that proclaimed their heritage and surrounded them with love from birth. "They will never doubt their worth," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of a vow. "Never wonder if they deserve the love they receive or the protection they're offered." "Never," Kieran agreed, his arms tightening around her. "And when they're old enough to understand, we'll tell them about the servant girl who found her courage in a stable full of beasts, and the Alpha King who learned that the strongest alliances are built on truth rather than convenience." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the peaceful kingdom spread below them and feeling their child respond to the contentment flowing through the mate bond. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and promise, a fitting backdrop for the hopes they were building together. "The Harvest Festival begins tomorrow," Kieran said eventually. "The first one in 20 years where the people will be celebrating their own prosperity rather than enduring taxation disguised as tradition." "Are you nervous?" Lyra asked, recognizing the slight tension that had crept into his voice. "Not nervous exactly, but this will be the first time we appear publicly since announcing the pregnancy. There will be expectations, ceremonies, formal presentations of gifts." He paused, then smiled ruefully. "I suppose I'm still adjusting to the idea that our personal happiness has become a matter of kingdom-wide celebration." Lyra understood his ambivalence. Privacy had been a luxury neither of them had enjoyed since their mate bond became public knowledge. Every aspect of their relationship was now seen as symbolic, every gesture analysed for its political implications. It was a burden that came with the crown, but sometimes she missed the simple intimacy of their stolen moments in the stable. "The people celebrate because they see hope in our bond," she said thoughtfully. "For 20 years they lived under rulers who took power through murder and deception. Now they have leaders who found each other through truth and chose love over political advantage. It represents the possibility that they too might find happiness beyond mere survival." "When did you become so wise about the hearts of rulers?" Kieran asked, his tone warm with affection. When I spent 3 years believing myself worthless while tending creatures who saw my value clearly, it teaches you to look beyond surface appearances to the truth underneath. She turned in his arms to face him directly. The people don't love us because we're perfect. They love us because we fought for the right to choose each other, and in doing so, we gave them permission to believe in their own worth. The truth of her words settled between them like a benediction. They had not set out to become symbols, but their journey from suppressed servant and duty-bound king to united rulers had given their people a story worth believing in. As if responding to their conversation, movement in the courtyard below caught their attention. A small group of children had gathered near the stable, clearly hoping for a glimpse of the legendary Starwin mare. When the magnificent creature approached the fence to accept their offered apples and carrots, their delighted laughter rose like music through the morning air. "Look," Lyra said, pointing to the scene below. "They're not afraid of her, even though she's clearly magical. They approach with respect and wonder, but no fear. Because they've grown up in a kingdom where magical creatures are protectors rather than threats, where being different is celebrated rather than suppressed." Kieran's voice carried deep satisfaction. "Our child will grow up in that world too." The thought filled Lyra with profound contentment. Their son or daughter would know from birth that they were cherished, that their unique gifts were treasures rather than burdens, that love was their birthright rather than something to be earned through perfect behaviour or political usefulness. "I should go prepare for the day's audiences," she said reluctantly, though duty called as it always did for those who ruled justly. "Actually," Kieran said, his tone carrying a hint of mischief that made the mate Bond flutter with curiosity, "I've taken the liberty of rearranging your schedule. The morning audiences have been postponed, the diplomatic meetings moved to tomorrow, and your afternoon council session cancelled entirely." "Kieran," she began, but he silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. "Today, you are not Queen Lyra of the Northern Crown. Today, you are simply my mate, carrying our child, deserving of rest and pampering and all the small pleasures that pregnancy should bring." His smile was warm with love and determination. "Elder Thorne has prepared a special meal in the garden. Lady Morwyn is waiting to share stories about your mother's pregnancy, and I have cleared my own schedule to spend the entire day focused on nothing but your happiness." Tears pricked at her eyes again, but these were tears of overwhelming joy rather than sorrow. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You chose courage over comfort. You chose truth over safety. You chose love over the fear of loss." His hands cupped her face with infinite tenderness. "And in doing so, you gave me the privilege of choosing you in return." The kiss they shared was soft and sweet, full of promises and contentment, and the absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as partners. Around them, the kingdom basked in autumn prosperity. The loyal beasts called their approval from the stables below, and somewhere in the distance, the gentle chiming of silver bells announced that even the magical creatures of legend were celebrating the peace that love and justice had finally brought. As they walked hand in hand toward a day devoted to simple pleasures and quiet joy, Lyra reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the servant girl who cleaned beast enclosures while believing herself worthless, to the queen who ruled with wisdom and compassion while carrying the future heir of two united kingdoms. The crown was never something she had to earn, she realized. It was something she had to remember she already wore. And now, surrounded by love and looking forward to the child who would grow up knowing their worth from the very beginning, she understood that the most important battles were not fought with swords and magic, but with the courage to believe that everyone, no matter how humble their beginnings, deserved happiness, love, and the chance to discover their own extraordinary worth. Some transformations, she thought, as Kieran's laughter joined hers in the golden morning air, were worth every struggle required to achieve them, but the greatest transformation of all was learning that she had been worthy of love all along. The sound of thundering hooves reached Lyra even through the thick stone walls of the stable, accompanied by the kind of commotion that only came with the arrival of true power. She abandoned her afternoon task of mucking the shadow-bear enclosures and climbed the narrow ladder to the hayloft, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't explain. From the single grimy window she had a perfect view of the castle's main courtyard, and what she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. Alpha King Kieran rode at the head of a column of mounted warriors, and even from a distance his presence was overwhelming. He sat his massive black stallion with the kind of casual authority that spoke of absolute confidence, his dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight as he surveyed the assembled crowd of nobles and servants who had gathered to witness his arrival. But it wasn't his commanding posture, or the way every other rider seemed diminished in comparison, that made Lyra's pulse quicken. It was something else, something that pulled at her chest with an intensity that bordered on physical pain, as if an invisible thread stretched between them across the courtyard, connecting her to this man she'd never met and had no right to even look upon. Magnificent, isn't he? Lyra spun around to find Elder Thorn climbing into the loft behind her, his weathered face creased with an expression she couldn't quite read. The Beastmaster rarely sought her out, except to deliver supplies or criticisms, and never in her private moments. I was just checking to see what the noise was about," she stammered, heat rising in her cheeks. "The creatures have been restless all morning." "Have they?" Thorn moved to stand beside her at the window, his pale eyes studying the scene below with the same intensity she'd been using. "And what do you think has them so agitated?" Lyra glanced down at the enclosures below, where Shadowfang paced restlessly at the front of his cage, his massive head turned toward the castle proper. The shadow bears were equally unsettled, and even the normally lethargic war panthers had roused themselves to press against their bars, golden eyes fixed in the same direction. "I don't know," she admitted. "They started acting strange around dawn, before the Alpha King arrived. It's like they're waiting for something." Thorn made a non-committal sound, but she caught him studying her profile with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Perhaps they sensed the significance of what's to come. The bonding ceremony will determine the kingdom's future after all. Below in the courtyard, Alpha King Kieran was dismounting, and even that simple action commanded attention. He moved with fluid grace despite his size, and when he turned to address the assembled nobles, Lyra found herself leaning forward despite herself. She was too far away to hear his words, but she could see the effect he had on everyone around him. Grown men straightened their shoulders and lifted their chins, as if trying to prove themselves worthy of his notice. Women's heads turned to follow his movement, their expressions ranging from awe to barely concealed desire. And why shouldn't they look? He was everything a king should be, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that demanded respect even from those who had never sworn him allegiance. His dark clothing was rich but practical, and the way he carried himself spoke of a man comfortable with command. Lyra pressed closer to the grimy window glass, trying to get a better look at his face, and that's when something impossible happened. As if drawn by some invisible force, Alpha King Kieran's head turned toward the stable. His gaze swept across the stone building with the kind of focused intensity that made her stomach clench, and for one heart-stopping moment his eyes seemed to lock directly onto hers. The world tilted. Heat exploded through Lyra's chest, spreading outward like wildfire until every nerve in her body was singing with an energy she'd never experienced. The invisible thread she'd imagined between them suddenly felt real, substantial, pulling so hard she had to grip the windowsill to keep from falling. And then Kieran looked away, his attention returning to the nobles surrounding him, and the moment shattered like glass. "Interesting," Thorn murmured beside her. Lyra dragged herself back from the window, her legs unsteady and her heart hammering against her ribs. "What's interesting?" But the Beastmaster was already turning away, his expression thoughtful in a way that made her nervous. "Nothing that concerns you, child. You should return to your duties." She wanted to argue, to demand an explanation for his cryptic behaviour and the strange way he'd been watching her. But Elder Thorne was already disappearing down the ladder, leaving her alone with questions that had no answers and a chest that still ached with phantom heat. Far below, the Alpha King was being escorted into the castle proper, his entourage following in a river of expensive fabric and polished steel. Soon the courtyard would return to normal, and life would resume its predictable pattern of servitude and invisibility. So why did she feel like everything had just changed? Lyra forced herself to climb down from the loft and return to her work, but concentration proved impossible. Her hands shook as she cleaned the Shadow Bear enclosures, and twice she found herself staring off into space, reliving that moment when the Alpha King's eyes had seemed to find hers across an impossible distance. It meant nothing, of course. He hadn't really seen her. From that distance, she was probably just a shadow in a window, if he'd noticed anything at all. The heat she'd felt had been her imagination, a lonely girl's fantasy sparked by witnessing power and authority she'd never known. But the creatures in her care seemed to have different ideas. Shadowfang followed her every movement as she worked, his yellow eyes tracking her with an alertness that went beyond simple interest. When she paused to rest between enclosures, he pressed his massive frame against the bars separating them, a low whine escaping his throat. "What's gotten into you today?" she asked, reaching through the bars to scratch behind his ears. "You're acting like you've never seen me before." The dire wolf's response was to nuzzle her palm with unusual gentleness, his enormous head pushing against her hand as if seeking comfort, or perhaps offering it. The shadow bears were equally strange, abandoning their usual aloof demeanour to crowd against their enclosure walls whenever she passed. Even the war panthers, who typically regarded her with lazy tolerance at best, seemed unusually focused on her movements. It was as if they sensed something she couldn't understand, some change in her that she couldn't perceive herself. By evening, the strange energy that had filled the stable all day had intensified rather than faded. Lyra completed her final rounds in a state of nervous exhaustion, jumping at every sound and fighting the constant urge to look toward the castle. She was securing the last enclosure when she heard voices approaching the stable entrance, male voices speaking in the clipped tones of authority. "The arrangements must be finalized tonight," one was saying. "Both Lady Seraphina and Lady Cordelia expect a decision by the ceremony's end." "I understand the political necessity," came the reply, and Lyra's breath caught. She recognized that voice from the courtyard, deep and commanding with an undertone of barely controlled power. Alpha King Kieran himself was approaching the stables. Panic flared in her chest. She wasn't supposed to be here this late, wasn't supposed to overhear conversations between royalty and their advisers. If they found her, she could be punished for eavesdropping, or worse. She looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the stable offered few options. The best she could do was duck behind the feed barrels in the corner and hope they would conduct their business quickly. "The alliance with the southern duchies depends on this union," the first voice continued, as footsteps echoed through the stone corridor. "Lady Seraphina brings military support we desperately need against the northern raiders." "And Lady Cordelia offers trade agreements that could stabilize our economy for decades," Kieran replied, but something in his tone suggested he found the whole discussion distasteful. "I'm well aware of what each woman represents politically." They were close enough now that Lyra could hear the rustle of expensive fabric and the soft clink of weapons and jewellery. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, praying they wouldn't venture far enough into the stable to discover her. "Then you understand why personal preference cannot factor into this decision," the adviser said. "The kingdom's stability must come first." There was a long pause, during which Lyra held her breath and tried to make herself as small as possible. When Kieran spoke again, his voice carried a strange note of frustration. "My wolf has been difficult since we arrived. Restless and aggressive in a way I've never experienced. It's making rational thought nearly impossible." Pre-ceremony nerves, perhaps. The significance of tomorrow's choice would affect any man. Perhaps. But Kieran didn't sound convinced. Their voices were moving closer, and Lyra realised with growing horror that they intended to tour the stable itself. She was trapped, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide that wouldn't expose her the moment they lit a torch or lamp. The footsteps paused just outside Shadowfang's enclosure, and she heard Kieran's sharp intake of breath. "This is the dire wolf that killed 3 handlers?" "Yes, Your Majesty. He's been impossible to manage since his capture. The only person who can safely approach him is a servant girl who tends the dangerous creatures. Lyra, I believe her name is." Even hidden in the shadows, Lyra felt heat flood her face at being discussed by the Alpha King himself. She pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle her breathing, terrified that even the smallest sound would give her away. "She's here now?" Kieran's voice had changed, taking on an edge of intense interest that made her pulse spike. "I doubt it. She typically completes her duties before evening meal. Though with the creatures as agitated as they've been today, perhaps she returned to check on them." Lyra's heart nearly stopped when she heard Kieran moving deeper into the stable, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He was searching, she realised, looking for her specifically. But why would the Alpha King care about the existence of a lowly servant? It made no sense unless he somehow knew she'd been watching from the loft window, unless he'd actually seen her and her unauthorised observation of his arrival had been noted and reported. Fear and something else, something that felt dangerously like anticipation, warred in her chest as the footsteps drew nearer to her hiding place. And then Shadowfang did something that changed everything. The massive dire wolf, who had been silent throughout the conversation, suddenly threw back his great head and released a sound unlike anything Lyra had ever heard him make. Not a howl exactly, but something deeper and more primal. A call that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the stable. Every creature in the building responded instantly. The shadow bears roared in harmony, the war panthers added their voices to the chorus, and even the smaller predators in the outer enclosures joined the cacophony. But it wasn't random noise. It was organised, purposeful, as if they were all responding to some unheard command, as if they were announcing something or someone. In the sudden chaos of sound, Lyra heard Kieran's sharp exhale, followed by what sounded like a muttered curse. His footsteps had stopped, but she could sense him standing frozen just a few yards from her hiding place. "Your Majesty!" The advisor's voice was strained, barely audible above the creature's chorus. "What's happening? I've never seen them behave this way." When Kieran answered, his voice was tight with something that might have been recognition or shock. "Neither have I. We should return to the castle. Tomorrow's ceremony requires my full attention." But even as he said the words, Lyra could hear the reluctance in his tone, as if leaving was the last thing he wanted to do. The footsteps retreated slowly, and gradually the creatures' voices faded back to normal. But the air in the stable remained charged with energy, crackling with possibilities that Lyra didn't dare name. When she finally emerged from her hiding place on shaking legs, Shadowfang was waiting at the front of his enclosure, his intelligent yellow eyes fixed on her with an expression that looked almost like approval. "What was that about?" she whispered, approaching his cage with unsteady steps. The dire wolf's response was to press his massive snout through the bars toward her, and when she reached out to touch him, she could have sworn she felt an echo of that same heat that had flooded through her when the Alpha King's eyes had found hers in the courtyard. As if somehow, impossibly, the 3 of them were connected by threads she couldn't see but could no longer deny. The crown that waits in shadows deep, where ancient beasts their vigil keep. The lullaby fragment whispered through her mind again, and this time it didn't fade. This time it felt like a promise, or perhaps a warning. Change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Dawn broke over the castle with an unusual stillness, as if the very air was holding its breath. Lyra had spent the night curled against Shadowfang's enclosure, unable to face the loneliness of her small quarters after the strange events of the previous evening. The dire wolf had remained alert throughout the dark hours, his massive presence a comfort she desperately needed. She woke to the sound of her own name being spoken in hushed, shocked whispers. "There she is," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying across the stable like a death knell. "I told you she'd finally lost her mind completely." "Sleeping in the beast's cage," Garrett added with malicious delight. "Look at that monster, curled around her like she's his cub. It's not natural." Lyra's eyes fluttered open to find herself indeed within Shadowfang's enclosure, though she had no memory of the cage door opening. The massive dire wolf was positioned protectively around her smaller form, his great head resting near her shoulder and one enormous paw stretched across her waist like a living blanket. More shocking still was the absolute peace on his usually fierce features. Shadowfang, who had killed 3 grown men for daring to approach him, looked as gentle as a house pet in sleep. "How did she get in there?" This from one of the newer stable hands, his voice tight with fear. "The door's still locked." Lyra sat up carefully, not wanting to disturb Shadowfang's rest, and that's when she noticed the other impossible thing. Every dangerous creature in the stable had positioned itself as close to her location as possible. The shadow bears pressed against the walls of their enclosures, massive paws extended through the bars toward her. The war panthers had abandoned their usual scattered positions to crowd at the front of their cages, golden eyes fixed on her with something that looked remarkably like reverence. They were all awake, all watching, all waiting. "She's bewitched them," Marcus continued, his voice rising with excitement at having such scandalous news to report. "Mark my words, there's dark magic at work here. No natural person could—" His words cut off abruptly as the stable door swung open with enough force to slam against the stone wall. Every servant in the building snapped to attention, shoulders straightening and heads bowing in automatic deference. Alpha King Kieran filled the doorway like a force of nature. Even in the dim morning light filtering through the high windows, his presence was overwhelming. He wore simple dark clothing, suitable for an early morning ride, but authority clung to him like a second skin. His hair was slightly dishevelled, as if he'd dressed hastily, and there was something wild in his dark eyes that made the air itself feel charged with electricity. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Up close, he was even more magnificent than he'd appeared from the loft window, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of masculine beauty that belonged in legends rather than reality. But it was the intensity of his focus that truly took her breath away. He was looking directly at her, not at the servants scrambling to bow properly, not at the unusual spectacle of creatures behaving strangely, but at her, as if she were the only person in the room worth his attention. "Everyone out," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its low volume. The stable hands didn't need to be told twice. They fled like scattered birds, Marcus and Garrett shooting frightened glances over their shoulders as they disappeared through the door. Within seconds the stable was empty, except for Lyra, still sitting in Shadowfang's enclosure, and the Alpha King who continued to study her with unnerving intensity. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of breathing from the various creatures who remained completely focused on the unfolding scene. Lyra wanted to speak, to apologize for whatever transgression had brought him here so early, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her entirely. Then Kieran took a step forward, and everything changed. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, fully into the stable, every creature in the building reacted as if struck by lightning. Shadowfang's great head snapped up, his yellow eyes locking onto the Alpha King with recognition that went beyond simple awareness. The dire wolf rose to his feet in one fluid motion, and then did something that made Lyra's heart stop. He bowed, not the cowering submission of a defeated animal, but the deep, respectful acknowledgement of one alpha recognizing another. Shadowfang's massive frame folded gracefully until his belly touched the stone floor, his great head lowered in a gesture of honor that Lyra had never seen him offer to any living being. And he wasn't alone. Throughout the stable, every shadow bear dropped to the floor of their enclosures, their enormous heads pressed low in identical gestures of respect. The war panthers stretched their sleek bodies along the ground, golden eyes never leaving Kieran's face. Even the smaller predators in the outer cages assumed positions of deference, as if responding to some unheard command, but they weren't looking at Kieran, they were looking at her. "Impossible," Kieran breathed, his voice rough with something that might have been awe or shock. His dark eyes moved from the bowing creatures to Lyra's face, and the intensity of his gaze made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. "They're not submitting to me." Lyra found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I don't understand what's happening." Kieran took another step forward, his movement causing Shadowfang to lift his great head and fix him with a steady, measuring stare. There was no aggression in the dire wolf's posture, but there was something else, something that made the air between the two powerful beings crackle with tension. "My wolf has been going insane since we arrived," Kieran said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Pacing, snarling, demanding I come here to find something. Someone." His eyes never left her face. "You." "Me?" The word came out as a squeak. "But I'm nobody. I'm just—" "You're sitting in a cage with a creature that has killed grown warriors," Kieran interrupted, gesturing to Shadowfang, who remained alert but calm beside her. "You're surrounded by the most dangerous predators in the kingdom, and they're treating you like—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Like royalty." As if summoned by his observation, Shadowfang moved closer to Lyra, pressing his massive frame against her side in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. The dire wolf's yellow eyes fixed on Kieran with an expression that was almost challenging, as if to say, "She is mine to protect." Kieran's reaction was immediate and startling. His entire body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice carried a roughness that hadn't been there before. "What is your name?" "Lyra," she managed, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Lyra." He repeated her name like he was tasting it, and something in his expression shifted, softened. "How long have you worked with these creatures?" 3 years, Your Majesty." She tried to stand, to offer proper respect, but Shadowfang's weight against her side kept her seated. The dire wolf showed no intention of moving. "And they've always behaved this way around you?" Lyra glanced around at the still bowing creatures, confusion and something that felt dangerously like hope warring in her chest. "No, Your Majesty, never like this. They're usually calmer with me than with others, but this is—" She gestured helplessly at the unprecedented display of deference. "I've never seen anything like it." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving between her face and the creatures surrounding them. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Neither have I." He took another step forward, then another, moving slowly as if approaching a wild animal himself. Shadowfang watched his progress with keen intelligence, but made no move to intercede. The dire wolf seemed to be evaluating Kieran, judging his intentions, and apparently finding them acceptable. When Kieran was close enough that Lyra could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, he crouched down outside the enclosure, bringing himself to her level. The position should have diminished his authority, but somehow it only made him seem more powerful, like a predator choosing to show restraint. "My wolf wants me to touch you," he said quietly, his honesty so unexpected that Lyra's breath caught. He's been demanding it since the moment we arrived. I don't understand it, and I certainly don't understand this." He gestured to the still bowing creatures around them. Lyra's pulse spiked at the thought of his hands on her skin, and she had to swallow hard before she could speak. "I don't understand any of it either. But you feel it too, don't you?" Kieran's voice was soft, almost gentle, but his eyes were intense. "Something connecting us, something that makes no sense." She wanted to deny it, to laugh off the suggestion that a king could feel any connection to a servant girl who slept with beasts. But the heat building in her chest, the invisible thread that seemed to pull her toward him, the way every nerve in her body was singing just from his proximity, made lies impossible. "Yes," she whispered. Kieran's eyes closed briefly, as if her admission had confirmed something he'd hoped and feared in equal measure. When he opened them again, they held a kind of desperate intensity that made her heart ache. "This is impossible," he said, but he was reaching through the bars of the enclosure even as he spoke the words. "You're a servant, and I'm bound by duty to choose a political mate tomorrow. We can't." But his fingers found hers anyway, skin touching skin for the first time, and the world exploded. Heat flooded through Lyra's entire body, starting from the point where their hands connected and radiating outward like molten gold. Every nerve ending came alive, singing with an energy she'd never experienced. Distantly, she was aware of Kieran's sharp intake of breath, of his fingers tightening around hers as if she were a lifeline in a storm. Around them, the creature's behaviour intensified. Shadowfang pressed closer to her side, a low rumble of approval vibrating through his massive chest. The other beasts lifted their heads from their bowing positions, watching the connection between her and Kieran with what looked remarkably like satisfaction, as if this was what they'd been waiting for all along. "What is this?" Lyra breathed, staring at their joined hands where something that looked almost like golden light seemed to shimmer beneath their skin. Kieran's voice was rough, strained. "I don't know, but I can't let go." Neither could she, though she knew she should. This was madness, a servant girl holding hands with the Alpha King while surrounded by bowing beasts in a stable that smelled of hay and predator musk. Tomorrow he would choose a proper mate, someone worthy of his station, and this moment would become nothing but a memory she'd treasure in secret for the rest of her life. But for now, just for now, she could pretend that the impossible was possible, that a nobody could matter to someone who was everything. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment like glass. Kieran's head snapped toward the stable entrance, and reluctantly, slowly, he released her hand. The loss of contact left Lyra feeling cold and empty, as if part of herself had been torn away. "Your Majesty?" Elderthorn's voice carried from the doorway, carefully neutral, but tinged with something that might have been knowing amusement. "Your advisers are looking for you. The final preparations for tomorrow's ceremony require your attention." Kieran rose to his feet, his expression shifting back to the controlled mask of authority he'd worn when he entered. But his eyes remained fixed on Lyra's face, dark and full of promises neither of them could keep. "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the tension Lyra could see in his shoulders. "I was just investigating the reports of unusual animal behaviour." "Indeed." Thorn's pale eyes moved between them, missing nothing. "And what did you discover, Your Majesty?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving Lyra's face. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured, that some mysteries require further investigation. With that cryptic statement, he turned and strode from the stable, leaving Lyra sitting in Shadowfang's cage, with her heart pounding and her hand still tingling from his touch. Elder Thorn remained in the doorway for several seconds after Kieran's departure, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he stepped into the stable, moving with the careful gait of someone who had learned to respect the creatures housed within these walls. "Interesting morning, child," he said mildly. Lyra struggled to find her voice. "I don't know what happened. The door was locked. I never opened it. But somehow I was inside when I woke up. And then all the creatures started acting strange. And the Alpha King—" She trailed off, unable to put the impossible events into words. "Yes?" Thorn said, his tone giving nothing away. "The Alpha King. Tell me, Lyra, how did it feel when he touched your hand?" Heat flooded her cheeks, but something in the elder's voice told her this wasn't idle curiosity. "Like fire," she admitted quietly, "like golden light running through my veins, like coming home." The words hit her with the force of revelation. That was exactly what it had felt like. Not the desperate attraction of a lonely girl for an unattainable man, but the deep, soul-deep recognition of something that had always belonged to her. "How did you know?" she whispered. Elder Thorn's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Because I've been waiting 20 years to see it happen." Before she could ask what he meant, he was turning to leave, pausing only to speak over his shoulder. "Rest well today, child. Tomorrow will bring changes you cannot yet imagine." And then she was alone with Shadowfang and the other creatures, all of whom had resumed their normal behaviours as if the morning's impossible events had never occurred. But the tingling in her hand remained, and the memory of golden light, and the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The castle had transformed overnight into a glittering monument to wealth and power. Lyra watched from her small window as servants scurried across the courtyard like industrious ants, carrying bolts of silk, arrangements of exotic flowers, and golden ornaments that caught the morning light like captured stars. The contrast between the opulence being displayed for the bonding ceremony and her own sparse quarters could not have been more stark. She pressed her fingers against the glass, still feeling the phantom warmth where Alpha King Kieran had touched her hand hours earlier. The memory of golden light and impossible connection seemed like a dream in the harsh light of day, when the reality of her situation reasserted itself with cruel clarity. Tomorrow he would choose a proper mate, someone beautiful, educated, politically valuable, someone who belonged in his world of power and privilege, and she would return to her beasts and her invisibility, carrying the secret of their moment like a shard of glass in her heart. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Before she could answer, it swung open to reveal a vision of perfection that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. Lady Seraphina glided into the small room like a creature from another realm entirely. Everything about her spoke of wealth and breeding, from the cascade of golden hair that fell in perfect waves down her back to the emerald silk gown that probably cost more than Lyra would earn in a lifetime. Her beauty was the kind that belonged in portraits and poems, flawless and ethereal. She was everything Lyra was not, and they both knew it. "So you're the stable girl," Seraphina said, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone who had been trained in proper speech from birth. Her green eyes swept over Lyra's simple brown dress and work-worn hands with barely concealed disdain. "How quaint." Lyra scrambled to her feet, offering an awkward curtsy that felt clumsy and inadequate. "My lady, I wasn't expecting— That is, did you need something from the stables?" Seraphina's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. "From the stables? Oh, my dear child, no. I came to see you." She moved deeper into the room, her silk skirts rustling with each graceful step. "You see, I have a problem." Every instinct Lyra possessed screamed danger, but she forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression neutral. "My lady, my intended seems distracted." Seraphina's perfectly manicured fingers traced along the rough wooden surface of Lyra's small table, her nose wrinkling slightly at the humble surroundings. "Distracted by something in the stables, according to my sources, something that has his wolf unusually agitated." Heat flooded Lyra's face, but she fought to keep her voice steady. "I wouldn't know anything about the Alpha King's concerns, my lady. I tend the beasts and nothing more." "Of course you don't." Seraphina's smile was sharp as a blade. A simple servant girl wouldn't understand the complexities of royal obligations, the importance of proper alliances, the consequences when those alliances are threatened. She moved closer, and Lyra caught the scent of expensive perfume, roses and something else, something that made her skin crawl with unease. There was something predatory in the way Seraphina moved, like a cat stalking a mouse. "Tell me about your work with the creatures," Seraphina continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "It must be dangerous tending such savage beasts. Accidents happen so easily around wild animals, don't they?" The threat was delicately veiled but unmistakable. Lyra's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice level. "The creatures aren't savage, my lady. They're intelligent beings who respond to respect and kindness." How charmingly naive! Seraphina's green eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement or malice. "You actually believe that, don't you? That those monsters see you as anything more than their next meal?" Despite her fear, Lyra felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of the creatures she'd devoted her life to caring for. "They're not monsters, they're—" "Weapons," Seraphina interrupted smoothly. "Tools of war, bred for killing and nothing else, just as you are a tool, though considerably less useful." She paused in front of Lyra, close enough that the height difference between them was painfully obvious. "Do you know what happens to broken tools?" Lyra's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to meet Seraphina's gaze. "No, my lady." "They're discarded, thrown away to make room for functional replacements." Seraphina's smile was beautiful and terrible. "I do hope you'll remember that in the coming days, for your own sake." She turned to leave, her silk skirts swirling around her like liquid emerald, but paused at the door to deliver one final blow. "Oh, and Lyra, if you're harbouring any foolish fantasies about yesterday's encounter, I suggest you abandon them immediately. Kings don't mate with stable girls, no matter how desperately those girls might wish otherwise. Tomorrow, Kieran will choose me, as duty demands, and you'll return to your proper place among the beasts where you belong." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Lyra alone with the lingering scent of roses and the terrible certainty that Lady Seraphina was far more dangerous than she appeared. Lyra sank onto her narrow bed, hands shaking with reaction. The lady's words had found their mark with surgical precision, confirming every fear and insecurity she'd spent years trying to suppress. What had she been thinking, allowing herself to believe, even for a moment, that the connection she'd felt with Kieran meant anything? She was nobody, a servant whose only value lay in her willingness to risk her life with creatures others feared. Tomorrow, Kieran would choose Seraphina, as politics demanded, and Lyra would be forgotten like yesterday's stable sweepings. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, another emotion stirred in her chest. Anger, hot and fierce, at being threatened and dismissed as if she were less than human, at being told her creatures were nothing but weapons and monsters, at having her worth determined by others who had never bothered to truly see her. She spent the rest of the day in the stables, throwing herself into her work with desperate intensity. If caring for beasts was her only value, then she would be the best beast-keeper the kingdom had ever seen. She cleaned enclosures until they gleamed, checked every creature for signs of injury or illness, and restocked supplies with meticulous attention to detail, but no amount of work could quiet the voice in her head that whispered Seraphina's words on endless repeat. "Kings don't mate with stable girls. You belong among the beasts. Broken tools are discarded." As evening approached, the sounds of celebration began to drift from the castle proper. Laughter, music, the clink of expensive goblets raised in toasts to the future. The pre-ceremony feast was in full swing, bringing together nobles from across the kingdom to witness tomorrow's momentous choice. Lyra was cleaning the War Panther's enclosure when she heard familiar voices approaching the stable. Her heart clenched with a mixture of hope and dread as she recognised Kieran's deep tones, accompanied by an older man whose voice carried the authority of a trusted adviser. "The preparations are complete," the adviser was saying as they entered the stable. Both ladies are eager for tomorrow's ceremony, though Lady Seraphina seems particularly confident of your choice." "Does she?" Kieran's voice was carefully neutral, but Lyra caught the edge of something that might have been irritation. "She has good reason to be. The Southern alliance she brings is exactly what we need to secure our borders. And she is exceptionally beautiful." "Yes," Kieran agreed, but there was no warmth in his voice. "She is all of that." They were moving deeper into the stable now, and Lyra realized she was trapped once again. The panther enclosure offered no hiding places, and any attempt to flee would only draw attention to her presence. "Your Majesty," the advisor continued, his tone carefully diplomatic. "I hope you don't mind my speaking plainly, but you seem distracted. Is there something troubling you about tomorrow's ceremony?" There was a long pause before Kieran answered, and when he did, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "What do you know about mate bonds, Aldwyn?" The advisor's sharp intake of breath was audible even from Lyra's position. "Mate bonds? Your Majesty, surely you're not suggesting those are rare beyond measure, legends mostly, and even if they did occur, duty must supersede personal desire. The kingdom's stability depends on political alliances, not supernatural fantasy." "I'm aware of my duties," Kieran replied, ice creeping into his tone. "But answer my question. What do you know of mate bonds?" "Only what the old stories tell. A connection between two souls, usually marked by unusual reactions from supernatural creatures, golden light when the bonded pair touches, physical pain when separated." Aldwyn's voice carried the sceptical tone of a practical man discussing fairy tales. "But Your Majesty, even if such things were possible, they could not supersede the needs of the kingdom. Your marriage tomorrow will secure peace and prosperity for generations. And if the bond is real, if my wolf has found its true mate, then you will honour your duty and learn to live with the pain of separation, as countless rulers have done before you." Aldwyn's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "Personal happiness is a luxury kings cannot afford." Lyra's heart clenched at the finality in the advisor's voice, at the casual dismissal of the impossible connection she'd felt with Kieran. Even if what they'd shared was real, even if it meant something beyond her understanding, it would never be enough to overcome the political realities that governed his life. "I see." Kieran's voice was quiet, defeated in a way that made Lyra want to weep. "Then it seems the matter is settled." "Indeed it is. Now shall we return to the feast? Lady Seraphina specifically requested another dance before the evening ends." Their footsteps began to retreat, but Kieran's voice stopped them just outside the war panther enclosure, where Lyra crouched in misery. "Aldwyn, what would happen to someone who interfered with a political marriage? Someone who might be seen as a threat to the alliance?" The question sent ice through Lyra's veins, but Aldwyn's answer was worse. "Threats to the kingdom's stability must be eliminated, Your Majesty, quickly and quietly, to avoid any disruption to the ceremony. General Aldrich's men are particularly skilled at handling such complications." "I see. And if this hypothetical threat were innocent of any wrongdoing, simply caught in circumstances beyond their control?" "Innocence is irrelevant when the kingdom's future is at stake." Aldwyn's tone was matter-of-fact, as if they were discussing crop rotations rather than murder. Better to eliminate a potential problem before it becomes an actual one. Kieran said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been grief. "Of course, the kingdom's needs must come first." This time their footsteps retreated completely, leaving Lyra alone with the terrible understanding that she was not just unwanted, but actively dangerous. Her very existence threatened the political marriage that would secure the kingdom's future, and there were those who would eliminate that threat without hesitation. As if summoned by her distress, the war panthers pressed against the bars of their enclosure, golden eyes reflecting her fear and anguish. Throughout the stable the other creatures stirred restlessly, sensing her emotional turmoil and responding to it with protective instincts that warmed her heart even as they broke it. These beautiful, intelligent beings saw her worth when no one else did. They offered comfort when the human world showed her only cruelty and dismissal. Perhaps Seraphina was right after all. Perhaps this was where she truly belonged, among the beasts who accepted her without question or conditions. At least here she was valued. At least here she was safe. The lie tasted bitter even in her own mind, but she clung to it anyway, because the alternative, the knowledge that even this small sanctuary might be stripped from her, was too terrible to bear. Tomorrow Kieran would choose his proper mate, and Lyra would become nothing more than a complication to be quietly eliminated. But tonight, surrounded by creatures who saw her as worthy of protection and care, she could pretend that she mattered to someone in this world, even if that someone walked on 4 legs and communicated in growls and purrs rather than words. The evening air hung heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine as Lyra made her final rounds through the stable, her movements mechanical and numb after the day's revelations. Lady Seraphina's threats echoed in her mind alongside the casual discussion of her elimination, creating a symphony of fear that made her hands shake as she checked water troughs and secured enclosure latches. She was so lost in her dark thoughts that she almost missed the soft footfall behind her. "You're working late tonight." Lyra spun around to find Elder Thorne emerging from the shadows near the feed storage, his weathered face grave in the flickering torchlight. Unlike his usual brisk efficiency, tonight he moved with deliberate care, as if approaching a wounded animal. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ceremony is tomorrow and everything feels—" "Different," Thorne supplied, studying her face with those pale, knowing eyes. "Yes, I imagine it does. The question is, child, are you ready to learn why?" Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. Throughout her years at the castle, Elder Thorne had been a distant figure, respected, but never particularly warm. Tonight, however, there was an intensity about him that suggested this conversation would change everything. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully. Thorne glanced around the stable, ensuring they were truly alone, then gestured for her to follow him to the small office tucked behind the feed storage. The cramped space contained little more than a desk, a few chairs and shelves lined with veterinary supplies, but tonight it felt like the most important room in the kingdom. "Sit," Thorne commanded gently, settling into the chair across from her. For a long moment he simply studied her face, as if memorizing every detail. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years. "Tell me about your earliest memory." The question caught her off guard. "My earliest memory? Why would that matter?" Humour an old man's curiosity. Lyra frowned, trying to reach back through the fog of years. "I remember arriving here. I was very young, maybe 5 or 6. A woman brought me, someone I called Aunt Mira, though I don't think she was truly my aunt. She spoke with you for a long time, and then she left without saying goodbye. And before that, do you remember anything from before you came to the castle?" "Fragments, mostly. A big house with tall windows, gardens that seemed to stretch forever, and—" She paused, the memory surfacing like something long buried. A woman singing, always singing, these beautiful lullabies about crowns and shadows and beasts who kept secrets. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his pale eyes. "What happened to your parents?" "Lyra!" The familiar ache settled in her chest. "They died when I was small. A fever, Aunt Mira said. That's why I was brought here to work in exchange for food and shelter." "And you've never questioned this story?" "Why would I? It's the only explanation I've ever had for why a child would be abandoned to work in the stables." She studied his face, unease growing with each passing second. "Elder Thorne, why are you asking me this?" Instead of answering directly, Thorne reached into a drawer of his desk and withdrew something that made Lyra's breath catch. It was a small silver pendant, tarnished with age but still beautiful, depicting a crown surrounded by wolves. "Do you recognize this?" Lyra's hand flew instinctively to her throat, where her own simple silver pendant rested beneath her rough work dress. The two pieces were nearly identical, though hers was smaller, as if designed for a child. Where did you get that? It belonged to your mother. Thorn's voice was gentle but implacable. Your real mother, Queen Ilara of the Northern Crown. The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She shot to her feet, the chair scraping against stone, her entire body rejecting the impossible statement. That's not possible. My mother was a commoner who died of fever. I'm nobody, just a servant girl who can speak to the most dangerous creatures in the kingdom and have them respond with love and loyalty, Thorn interrupted quietly. Who sleeps in the cage of a dire wolf that has killed grown men, who causes every beast in the stable to bow when an alpha king looks upon her. Those are coincidences, strange quirks that... Lyra. Thorn's voice cut through her protests with authority she'd never heard from him before. Your parents were King Aldwyn and Queen Ilara of the Northern Crown. They were murdered when you were 5 years old, poisoned at a diplomatic feast by those who sought to claim their territory. The room seemed to spin around her. Lyra gripped the edge of the desk, struggling to breathe as the foundation of everything she'd believed about herself crumbled. No, that's impossible. If that were true, someone would have known. Someone would have claimed me, protected me. Someone did protect you. Thorn rose from his chair, moving to stand before her with an expression of infinite sadness. Your mother, in her dying breath, cast a powerful spell of concealment. She bound your royal blood, suppressed your abilities, made you appear as common as any servant girl. It was the only way to keep you alive when your parents' murderers were searching for any surviving heirs. Lyra's hand found her pendant, the simple silver disc she'd worn for as long as she could remember. It felt warm against her palm, warmer than it should have been. The pendant, she whispered, is the anchor for your mother's spell. As long as you wore it, as long as you believed yourself to be nothing more than a servant, the concealment held. But mate bonds are ancient magic, more powerful than any spell ever woven. Thorn's pale eyes fixed on her face. When Alpha King Kieran touched your hand, when his wolf recognized yours, it began breaking down the barriers your mother built. As if summoned by his words, heat began to build in Lyra's chest, radiating outward like liquid fire. The pendant against her throat grew warmer, and she could have sworn she saw light beginning to glow beneath her skin. I can feel it, she gasped, pressing her hands against her chest as power stirred in places she'd never known existed. Something's happening to me. The suppression is failing, Thorn confirmed, his voice tight with urgency. Your true nature is fighting to emerge, and it won't be contained much longer. The question is, what will you do when it breaks free completely? I don't understand what you're asking. Thorn moved to another drawer, withdrawing a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. When he unfolded it, Lyra saw items that seemed to glow with their own inner light. A silver circlet set with midnight blue stones, a cloak that shimmered like starlight, and a blade whose edge sang with power. These belong to your mother, he said quietly, hidden away for 20 years, waiting for the day when you would be strong enough to claim them. Lyra stared at the artifacts of royalty, her mind reeling. Everything she'd believed about herself, every assumption about her worth and place in the world, was crashing down around her. Why now? She whispered. Why tell me this now? Because tomorrow Kieran will be forced to choose a political mate, and that choice will destroy him. His wolf has found its true match in you, and the bond will not be easily broken. Thorn's expression was grave, but more importantly, because General Aldrich is your parents' murderer, and his daughter Seraphina knows that something supernatural is occurring. They will not allow any threat to their plans to survive. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Lady Seraphina's visit, her veiled threats, the conversation between Kieran and his advisor about eliminating complications. They already suspected her significance, and once the ceremony was complete, they would move to eliminate her permanently. "They're going to kill me," she breathed. "They will try." Thorn's voice was steady, but his eyes blazed with an anger she'd never seen from him. "Unless you choose to fight." "Fight? I'm nobody. I'm weak, powerless." "You are the rightful queen of the Northern Crown, child. You have the blood of ancient magic in your veins, power that has been bound but never destroyed. The beasts recognize you because you are their natural sovereign, gifted with the ability to speak to all living creatures." As if responding to his words, sounds began to emerge from throughout the stable. Not the normal settling noises of evening, but something more purposeful. Shadowfang's deep howl rose above the others, joined by the roars of shadow bears and the hunting cries of war panthers. They were calling to her, Lyra realized, acknowledging something in her that she was only beginning to understand herself. "The mate bond with Kieran is breaking down your mother's spell," Thorn continued urgently. "Each moment you spend in his presence, each touch you share, weakens the concealment further. Soon your true nature will emerge whether you will it or not. But Kieran is going to marry Seraphina tomorrow. He has to, for the kingdom's alliance." "Does he?" Thorn's pale eyes held a glitter that might have been hope or mischief. "Tell me, child, what is stronger, political necessity or the call of a true mate bond?" Lyra thought of the golden light that had flowed between them when their hands touched, the way Kieran's wolf had responded to her presence, the anguish in his voice when he'd spoken of duty versus desire. "I don't know," she admitted. "Then perhaps it's time you found out." Thorn gestured to the royal artifacts laid out before them. "But first, you must choose who you wish to be. The frightened servant girl who hides among the beasts, or the queen who was born to rule beside an alpha king." The pendant at her throat was burning now, silver metal growing so hot it nearly seared her skin. Around them, the calls of the creatures grew louder, more insistent, as if they sensed the moment of decision approaching. Lyra stared at the circlet that had belonged to her mother, at the blade that sang with ancient power, at the cloak that seemed woven from starlight itself. They were beautiful, terrible, and completely beyond anything she'd ever dared to dream. "If I take these," she whispered, "if I become what you say I am, there's no going back, is there?" "No," Thorn agreed quietly. "There is no going back. You will be declaring yourself an enemy of those who murdered your parents. You will be challenging the political marriage that half the kingdom's stability depends upon. You will be claiming a throne that others have held for 20 years. And Kieran? We'll have to choose between duty and the call of his wolf, between political necessity and the mate the universe selected for him." The pendant gave a final pulse of searing heat, and then, with a sound like crystal breaking, cracked down the centre. Light poured from the fracture, golden and pure, flooding the small office with radiance that made Thorn shield his eyes. Power rushed through Lyra's body like a river breaking through a dam. 20 years of suppressed magic flooded her system, awakening abilities she'd never known she possessed. She could suddenly sense every creature in the stable with perfect clarity, feel their emotions and intentions as clearly as her own thoughts. But more than that, she could feel Kieran. Miles away in the castle proper, attending his pre-ceremony feast, she could sense his wolf's distress at their separation, could feel the mate bond pulling at him with the same intensity it pulled at her. He was in pain, fighting his instincts every moment they remained apart, and that pain called to something fierce and protective in her newly awakened soul. "The choice is made, then," Thorn observed, watching as golden light continued to pour from her skin. Lyra reached for the circlet with steady hands, feeling its weight settle onto her brow like a benediction. The cloak flowed around her shoulders like liquid shadow, and the blade's song harmonized with the power humming in her veins. "Yes," she said, and her voice carried an authority that had never been there before. "The choice is made." She was no longer the expendable beastkeeper who accepted cruelty and dismissal as her due. She was Lyra, daughter of King Aldwyn and Queen Ilara, rightful queen of the Northern Crown, and tomorrow she would fight for the mate the universe had chosen for her, regardless of what politics demanded. The war for her destiny was about to begin. The midnight hour struck with crystalline clarity as Lyra stood in the transformed stable, power humming through her veins like liquid starlight. The royal artifacts she now wore felt both foreign and familiar, as if they were always meant to be hers. Elder Thorne had departed after ensuring she understood the basics of controlling her awakened abilities, leaving her alone to grapple with the enormity of what she'd become. But she wasn't truly alone. Through the mate bond that now blazed like a beacon in her chest, she could sense Kieran's restless energy. He was moving through the castle corridors, his wolf driving him towards something he couldn't name but couldn't resist. The pull between them had intensified tenfold since her awakening, becoming a living thing that demanded acknowledgement. She didn't have to wait long. Kieran appeared in the stable doorway like a man possessed, his dark hair dishevelled and his formal feast attire rumpled as if he'd been running his hands through fabric in frustration. The torchlight caught the wild look in his eyes, the tension that held his powerful frame rigid with barely controlled energy. He stopped dead when he saw her. The simple servant's dress was gone, replaced by the flowing starlight cloak that seemed to move with a will of its own. The silver circlet rested on her brow like it had always belonged there, casting intricate shadows across her face. But it was the blade at her side that made his breath catch, its ancient power singing a harmony that resonated with his wolf's soul. "Impossible," he breathed, but his voice carried wonder rather than disbelief. Lyra stepped from the shadows, and the very air around her seemed to shimmer with unleashed power. "Is it? Your wolf knew what I was before I did." Kieran's eyes never left her face as he moved deeper into the stable, his approach both cautious and inevitable. "The servant girl is gone." "She was never real," Lyra replied, her voice carrying the authority of her awakened heritage. "Just a mask to hide what your enemies feared most." "My enemies?" "The ones who murdered my parents and have spent 20 years believing they were safe from retribution." The blade at her side pulsed with golden light, responding to the anger in her voice. "General Aldrich and his daughter have grown careless, confident that all threats to their stolen power were eliminated long ago." Understanding dawned in Kieran's dark eyes, followed immediately by a fury that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Seraphina's family killed your parents, that's why." He gestured helplessly at the transformed woman before him, struggling to reconcile the frightened stable girl with this luminous queen. "That's why the mate bond," Lyra confirmed, moving closer until only a few feet separated them. "The universe has a sense of justice, it seems. Your true mate is the one person who can destroy the alliance they've worked so hard to secure." Kieran's hands clenched at his sides, every muscle in his body taut with the effort of restraining his wolf. "This changes nothing. I still have duties, obligations." "To marry your parents' killer's daughter?" The question was soft, but it cut through his protest, like the blade at her side could cut through armour. "To bind yourself for life to someone who would see me dead before dawn if she suspected what I truly am." "The kingdom needs this alliance," Kieran said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Without the southern military support, the northern raiders will overrun our borders within the year." Lyra reached up and touched the circlet on her brow, feeling its weight and the responsibility it represented. "The Northern Crown has ancient treaties with the mountain clans, agreements that predate any raider threat, military support that comes without the price of a loveless political marriage." "Those treaties died with your parents." "No," Lyra said quietly, power flowing through her voice like music. "They died with the servants and commoners everyone believed us to be, but I am Queen Lyra of the Northern Crown, daughter of Aldwyn and Ilara, and those treaties live in me." The mate bond pulled between them like a physical force, golden threads of connection that neither could deny. Kieran took another step forward, his resolve crumbling with each passing moment. "Even if that's true," he said roughly, "even if you can provide the military support we need, tomorrow's ceremony has already been announced. The nobles expect a choice between Serafina and Cordelia. To change course now would be seen as weakness, instability. Would it?" Lyra moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the way his pulse jumped in his throat. Or would it be seen as strength? A king who refuses to be bound by political machinations, who chooses his mate based on the ancient wisdom of the wolf bond rather than human scheming. Kieran's breath came faster as she approached, his wolf responding to her proximity with desperate hunger. "You don't understand the pressures of rule, the compromises that must be made." "Don't I?" Lyra's voice carried centuries of royal authority, the weight of a bloodline that had ruled justly for generations. "I am the daughter of kings, Kieran. I was born to rule, trained from birth to put my people's needs above my own desires. The difference is that I've also learned what it means to be powerless, to be dismissed and threatened and treated as disposable." She was close enough to touch him now, to see the war raging behind his eyes as duty battled with the undeniable pull of their connection. "I know what it feels like to believe yourself worthless," she continued softly. "And I know what it feels like to discover that everything you were told about your value was a lie designed to keep you small and manageable." Kieran's control finally cracked. His hand rose to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. "Lyra." The moment their skin connected, the mate bond exploded between them with the force of a lightning strike. Golden light poured from the point of contact, racing through their bodies and filling the stable with radiance that made the torches pale in comparison. Kieran's sharp intake of breath mingled with her soft cry of wonder as power flowed between them, each recognizing the perfect completion they found in the other. His wolf rose to the surface, amber bleeding into his dark eyes as it acknowledged its true mate. "This is what they're asking you to deny," Lyra whispered against his palm. "This connection, this recognition that goes deeper than politics or convenience. Can you really bind yourself to another when your soul knows it belongs here?" "I can't," Kieran admitted, his voice raw with anguish. "I've tried to convince myself that duty matters more than this, but every moment away from you is agony. My wolf won't accept anyone else." "Then don't ask him to." Kieran's other hand found her waist, drawing her closer until they were breathing the same air, until the golden light of their bond surrounded them like a cocoon. "If I choose you, it will mean war. Serafina's family won't accept the broken alliance peacefully." "There's already been war," Lyra replied, her own hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. "They waged it against my family 20 years ago, and they've been fighting to keep the spoils ever since. The only question is whether you'll face it with your true mate at your side or struggle alone while bound to your enemies." The truth of her words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of realization through both their minds. This wasn't just about their personal happiness or the mate bond that drew them together. This was about justice, about righting an old wrong, about reclaiming power that had been stolen through murder and deception. "The ceremony is tomorrow," Kieran said, but his tone had shifted from resignation to something that might have been hope. "Yes," Lyra agreed, rising up on her toes until her lips were barely a breath away from his. "Tomorrow you can choose duty and a lifetime of regret, or you can choose the mate your wolf has already claimed and face the future as it was always meant to be faced, together." For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stood frozen in perfect balance, the mate bond singing between them while the weight of kingdoms and ancient grudges pressed down upon their shoulders. Then Kieran's resolve shattered completely. His mouth claimed hers with desperate hunger, 20 years of loneliness and political isolation pouring into a kiss that sealed their fate as surely as any ceremonial vow. The mate bond flared between them like a star being born, golden light cascading through the stable and causing every creature within to lift their voices in harmonious approval. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together as they struggled to process the magnitude of what they'd just acknowledged. "I choose you," Kieran whispered against her lips. "Tomorrow, before all the assembled nobles, I choose my true mate." "Even knowing what it will cost?" "Especially knowing what it will cost. Some prices are worth paying." Around them, the creatures of the stable settled into peaceful rest, as if their sovereign's happiness had brought them a contentment they'd never known. The golden light of the mate bond continued to pulse gently between Lyra and Kieran, a visible manifestation of the connection that would bind them for life. But even in the warmth of acknowledged love, darker thoughts intruded. Tomorrow's ceremony would bring confrontation, would force choices that could not be unmade. General Eldrick and Lady Seraphina would not accept this development quietly, and there were those in the kingdom who valued political stability above all else. The war for their right to choose each other was only beginning, but tonight, wrapped in starlight and surrounded by loyal beasts, Queen Lyra and Alpha King Kieran allowed themselves to believe that love might triumph over political necessity after all, even if they had to fight the entire world to prove it. The great hall had been transformed into a vision of royal splendour that took Lyra's breath away, even from her hidden vantage point in the stable loft. Banners of gold and crimson draped from the soaring stone arches, and hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across the assembled nobility who had gathered to witness what they believed would be a routine political alliance. If only they knew how wrong they were. Lyra pressed against the grimy window, her newly awakened senses allowing her to perceive details that would have been impossible before. She could see the tension in Kieran's shoulders as he stood at the ceremonial altar, magnificent in his formal robes of midnight blue, could smell the anxiety and anticipation radiating from the crowd below, the complex mixture of perfume and sweat and barely contained ambition. But most clearly of all, she could feel the mate bond stretching between them like a golden thread, growing more painful with each passing moment they remained separated. Lady Seraphina stood to the right of the altar, resplendent in a gown of emerald silk that complemented her golden hair perfectly. She was the picture of confident expectation, her beautiful face serene with the certainty of victory. Beside her, Lady Cordelia waited in pale blue satin, though even from a distance Lyra could sense the older woman's resignation. Everyone knew who Kieran was expected to choose. The ceremony had all the pomp and grandeur befitting a royal bonding. Ancient words were spoken in languages that predated the current kingdom, ritual wines were blessed and presented, and the assembled nobles murmured their approval at appropriate moments. It was a carefully choreographed dance of politics and tradition, beautiful and hollow as gilt paint over rotting wood. Lyra's hand moved instinctively to the silver circlet hidden beneath the simple servant's cloak she donned to avoid detection. The royal artifacts pulsed with warmth against her skin, as if they too recognized the mockery being played out below. Elder Thorne had counselled patience. "Wait until the crucial moment," he'd said. "Let Kieran demonstrate his choice before revealing yourself." But every instinct Lyra possessed screamed against watching him endure this charade, while the mate bond tore at both their souls. In the hall below, the ceremonial portion was drawing to a close. The officiating priest raised his hands for silence, his voice carrying across the expectant crowd. "Alpha King Kieran of the Western Realms, the time has come for you to choose your queen from among these worthy ladies. Speak now the name of she who shall rule beside you and bear the heirs of your bloodline." The hall fell silent with the weight of held breath, every eye fixed upon Kieran, waiting for the words that would shape the kingdom's future. Lady Seraphina lifted her chin proudly, her green eyes bright with triumph. Kieran stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "I choose—" He stopped mid-sentence, his entire body going rigid as if struck by lightning. His head turned sharply toward the direction of the stables, dark eyes blazing with an intensity that sent murmurs rippling through the crowd. Lyra gasped, pressing her hand against the burning ache in her chest. The mate bond was pulling at him with desperate urgency. His wolf no longer willing to be denied. Even from her hidden position, she could see the war raging in his expression, duty battling against the undeniable call of their connection. "Your Majesty?" the priest prompted, confusion evident in his voice. "Your choice." Kieran's hands clenched at his sides, his jaw working as if the words were being torn from his throat against his will. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with strain. "I choose." He paused again, his gaze still fixed in her direction, and Lyra could practically see his resolve cracking. "I cannot choose." The hall erupted in shocked whispers. Lady Seraphina's confident expression faltered, replaced by something that might have been panic. Even Lady Cordelia looked startled by this unexpected development. "Your Majesty," the priest said carefully, "the ceremony requires a choice. The alliance—" "I am aware of what the ceremony requires," Kieran cut him off, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. "But I find myself unable to proceed as planned." In the stable below Lyra's position, the creatures began to stir restlessly. Shadowfang's deep howl rose above the distant sounds of confusion, joined by the roars and calls of every beast in their care. They could sense her distress, could feel the mate bond's painful pull through their connection to her. The sound carried clearly to the great hall, causing several nobles to turn toward the windows in alarm. But Lyra had eyes only for Kieran, who stood frozen at the altar as his carefully constructed walls of duty finally began to crumble. Lady Seraphina stepped forward, her voice pitched to carry across the hall while maintaining its musical quality. "My lord, surely you cannot mean to leave this choice unmade. The kingdom requires stability, requires the alliance my family offers." "Does it?" Kieran's question was quiet, but it cut through the hall's murmurs like a blade. "Tell me, Lady Seraphina, what do you know of the ancient treaties between the Western realms and the Northern Crown?" Something flickered across Seraphina's perfect features, too quick to be easily identified, but unmistakably dangerous. "The Northern Crown fell 20 years ago, Your Majesty. Their treaties died with them." "Did they?" Kieran's voice was getting stronger, more certain with each word. "Or do they perhaps live on in ways we have not considered?" Lyra's breath caught. He was preparing to reveal her existence, to challenge the very foundation of Seraphina's claim to necessity. But doing so would put her in immediate danger, would expose her to the very people who had murdered her parents. As if responding to her thoughts, movement in the hall caught her attention. General Aldrich was making his way through the crowd, his weathered face grim with purpose. Behind him came a handful of his most trusted soldiers, their hands resting casually on their weapons. They knew. Somehow they had realized that their carefully laid plans were unraveling, and they were moving to eliminate the threat before it could fully manifest. Panic flooded through Lyra's system, her newly awakened instincts screaming warnings that made her pulse race. She had to get to Kieran, had to warn him about the danger approaching through the crowd. But leaving her hiding place would expose her to those same threats, would make her an easy target for elimination. Below in the hall, Kieran continued his verbal dance around the truth, his voice growing more confident as his wolf's desires aligned with his conscious mind. "I find myself wondering," he said, addressing the crowd rather than the priest, "what defines a worthy alliance? Military strength, ancient bloodlines, or perhaps something deeper, something that speaks to the very soul of leadership?" "Your Majesty," Lady Seraphina's voice held a note of steel beneath its musical quality, Surely you do not mean to set aside years of careful negotiation for philosophical musings." "Perhaps I do." Kieran's gaze swept over the assembled nobles, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Perhaps I believe that the strongest alliances are built on truth rather than convenience." General Aldrich was closer now, close enough that Lyra could see the calculation in his cold eyes. His soldiers were spreading out through the crowd, positioning themselves with the practiced efficiency of men preparing for violence. They were going to strike during the ceremony itself, she realized with growing horror, would eliminate any threat to their plans, while hundreds of witnesses were focused on the altar, would make it appear as if they were protecting the king from some unknown danger. The mate bond pulsed with increasing urgency, Kieran's wolf sensing the approaching threat, even if his human consciousness remained focused on the political drama unfolding around him. His head turned sharply toward the stable again, dark eyes blazing with desperate need. In that moment, Lyra made her choice. She could not watch from safety while her mate walked unknowingly into danger. Could not preserve her own life while those who had murdered her parents prepared to complete their conquest. The frightened servant girl who had hidden among the beasts was gone forever, burned away in the golden fire of her awakening. In her place stood Queen Lyra of the Northern Crown, daughter of murdered kings, rightful heir to ancient power, and she would not cower in shadows while her people's enemies moved against her mate. The royal blade at her side sang as she drew it, ancient power flowing through the metal like liquid starlight. The circlet on her brow blazed with inner fire, and the cloak around her shoulders billowed with wind that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Shadowfang," she called softly, knowing her voice would carry to the great dire wolf despite the distance. "Gather our people. It's time they knew their true queen." The answering howl shook the very foundations of the castle, a sound of such primal power that the ceremony below ground to a complete halt. Every head turned toward the stables as the calls of dozens of creatures joined the chorus, announcing to all who would hear that something momentous was about to occur. Lyra stepped from the loft window onto empty air, trusting in her awakened power to carry her safely down. Magic cushioned her landing in the courtyard below, and she began walking toward the great hall with measured steps that rang against the cobblestones like a death knell. Behind her came Shadowfang and the other creatures, freed from their enclosures by power that bent iron bars like flower stems. They formed an honor guard that would have terrified any army, but they moved with the disciplined precision of royal guardians rather than wild beasts. The great hall's doors swung open before her without any hand touching them, ancient magic responding to royal blood as it had for centuries before her birth. The assembled nobles turned as one to stare at the impossible sight walking through their midst. A young woman in starlight and shadow, crowned with silver, and accompanied by beasts that should have been caged, moving with the authority of someone born to rule. General Aldrich's eyes widened with recognition and terror, his hand flying to his sword as he realized that his greatest fear had finally come to pass. The lost heir had returned, and she was no longer the helpless child they had tried so hard to eliminate. "Impossible," Lady Seraphina breathed, her perfect composure cracking as she stared at the approaching figure. At the altar, Kieran's face blazed with such fierce joy that it was painful to look upon. His wolf had found its mate, and nothing in heaven or earth would keep them apart again. "No," Lyra said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness, reaching every corner of the hall with the authority of ancient magic. "Not impossible, inevitable." The war for her throne and her mate was about to begin. The great hall erupted into chaos as Lyra's dramatic entrance shattered 20 years of carefully constructed lies. Nobles scrambled backward from her path, their faces pale with terror at the sight of the dire wolf and shadow bears that flanked her like royal guardians. The air itself seemed to crackle with ancient power, making the fine hairs on every arm stand at attention. But it was General Aldrich's reaction that confirmed what everyone was beginning to suspect. "Kill her!" he roared, his weathered face twisted with desperate fury as he drew his sword. "Kill the pretender before she can spread her poison." His soldiers moved instantly, trained reflexes overriding their shock as they surged through the panicking crowd toward their target. Steel sang as blades cleared sheaths, and the ceremonial gathering transformed into a battlefield in the space between heartbeats. Lady Seraphina's perfect mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath her beauty. "Father, no, not here, not with so many witnesses." "She is the witnesses' problem now," Aldrich snarled, cutting down a fleeing nobleman who stumbled into his path. 20 years we've waited for this threat to reveal itself. I will not let some stable wench destroy everything we've built." Lyra's response was swift and terrible. The royal blade in her hand erupted with golden fire as she met the first attacker, ancient steel singing through the air with deadly precision. But it wasn't just her weapon that had awakened to its full power. Her body moved with inhuman grace, 20 years of suppressed royal blood finally flowing free through her veins. She was no longer the frightened servant who had cleaned beast enclosures while enduring mockery and threats. She was the daughter of warrior kings, heir to centuries of battle-tested bloodline, and every instinct honed by generations of combat flowed through her like molten gold. The first soldier's blade shattered against hers, the inferior metal unable to withstand the power channeling through her weapon. Her riposte opened his throat in a spray of crimson that sent nearby nobles screaming for the exits. But she was not alone in the fight. Shadowfang's roar shook the stone pillars of the great hall as the massive dire wolf launched himself at the nearest threat to his queen. 3 soldiers went down beneath his weight, their armour no match for claws that could rend stone. The shadow bears followed his lead, their massive forms clearing a path through Aldrich's men with devastating efficiency. At the altar, Kieran fought to reach her, his own blade cutting through the chaos as his wolf howled with protective fury. But the crowd of panicking nobles blocked his path, their terror making them obstacles rather than allies. "Lyra!" he shouted over the din of battle, his voice raw with desperation. She heard him, felt his anguish through the mate bond, but could not spare attention from the 3 soldiers converging on her position. Her transformed abilities allowed her to track their movements with perfect clarity, to anticipate their attacks before they were fully formed, but she was still vastly outnumbered. The royal blade swept in a glittering arc, severing the spear thrust aimed at her heart. A reverse cut opened the wielder's chest, but even as he fell, 2 more soldiers pressed forward to take his place. "You should have stayed hidden, girl," General Aldrich called, fighting his way toward her through the melee. "Should have died quietly in some stable accident like I planned." "Like you planned for my parents?" Lyra's voice carried clearly despite the chaos, her words cutting through the noise with the authority of awakened royalty. "Tell me, Aldrich, do you still taste the poison you used? Does it burn your dreams at night?" Aldrich's face went white with shock that she knew the truth, but his sword never wavered. "Your parents were weak rulers who would have destroyed this kingdom with their soft policies. I did what was necessary." "You murdered them for their throne?" Power blazed around Lyra like a living thing, the air shimmering with heat as her fury reached new heights. "Killed them and tried to kill their child to satisfy your ambition." The truth hung in the air between them, witnessed by dozens of nobles who had survived the initial chaos. Gasps and cries of horror rose from the crowd as the full scope of Aldrich's crimes became clear. But confession brought no absolution, only greater desperation. Aldrich lunged forward with the skill of a lifetime soldier, his blade aimed at her heart with deadly precision. But Lyra was no longer the helpless child he had sought to eliminate. She was queen of the Northern Crown, wielder of ancient power, and she would not fall to the sword that had already taken too much from her. Their blades met with a sound like thunder, sparks flying as steel met enchanted metal. Aldrich's superior experience showed in his technique, his attacks flowing with practiced efficiency. But Lyra's awakened heritage made her faster, stronger, her royal blood singing with power that no amount of training could match. The duel raged across the great hall, crushing flower arrangements and scattering ceremonial wine as they fought with lethal intensity. Around them, the battle continued as Shadowfang and the other creatures faced down the remaining soldiers. But the real war was between the two figures locked in mortal combat. Aldrich's blade found its mark, opening a line of fire across Lyra's shoulder. But her riposte nearly took his head, forcing him to stumble backward with a curse. "You cannot win, girl," he panted, sweat streaming down his weathered face. "Even if you kill me, Seraphina will rule beside the Alpha King. My bloodline will still claim the throne you think belongs to you." "Will it?" Lyra's voice was deadly quiet, her golden eyes fixed on his face with predatory intensity. "Look around you, Aldrich. Look at your daughter." Against his will, Aldrich's gaze flicked toward the altar, where Lady Seraphina cowered behind the ceremonial table. Her perfect beauty was marred by tear-streaked makeup and the wild look of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. More importantly, she was utterly alone. The nobles who had once courted her favour had fled or fallen. The soldiers who had served her family were dead or dying. And Kieran stood at the centre of the devastation, his dark eyes blazing with fury as he stared at the woman who had helped orchestrate his mate's suffering. "No," Seraphina whispered, her voice barely audible above the dying sounds of battle. "This isn't how it was supposed to happen. I was supposed to be queen. I was supposed to—" "You were supposed to pay for your family's crimes," Lyra said, her blade never wavering from Aldrich's throat despite the conversation. "Both of you." Desperation made Aldrich faster than he had any right to be at his age. His sudden lunge caught Lyra off guard, his sword slicing deep into her side before she could fully dodge. Pain exploded through her body, but it only fed the fire of her awakened power. Golden light erupted from her wounded flesh, washing over the great hall in waves that made every remaining candle flame dance wildly. The royal circlet on her brow blazed like a star, and when she raised her blade for the final strike, it sang with the voices of every northern king who had ever wielded it. "For my parents," she whispered. The ancient steel took Aldrich's head with a single, perfect cut. Silence fell over the great hall like a burial shroud. The general's body crumpled to the blood-stained floor, his ambitious dreams dying with him. Lady Seraphina's scream of anguish echoed off the stone walls, but it could not bring back what was lost. Lyra stood over her parents' killer, golden light still flowing from her wounds, the royal blade dripping crimson onto the ceremonial carpets. She was magnificent and terrible, a figure from legend made flesh, and every person still breathing in the hall knew they were witnessing history. The lost queen had returned, and her justice was both swift and absolute. Kieran reached her side as she swayed from blood loss and exhaustion, his strong arms catching her before she could fall. The mate bond blazed between them, golden threads of connection visible to all who watched. "It's over," he said softly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "They can't hurt you any more." But even as he spoke, Lyra's enhanced hearing caught the sound of running feet, of voices raised in alarm and organisation. General Aldrich's death had not ended the threat, only changed its nature. Others would come, political allies who had profited from the general's rule, soldiers loyal to his memory rather than the truth, those who preferred the stability of familiar corruption to the uncertainty of justice. The battle for her throne had only just begun, but as she leaned into Kieran's strength, surrounded by the loyal beasts who had always seen her true worth, Lyra felt something she had never experienced before, Hope, not the desperate, fragile hope of a servant dreaming of better days, but the fierce, unbreakable hope of a queen who had finally claimed her birthright. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, as the daughter of kings, the mate of an alpha, the rightful ruler of the Northern Crown, and she would never be powerless again. Dawn broke over a castle transformed by truth and bloodshed. The great hall bore the scars of the previous night's battle, its ceremonial grandeur replaced by the harsh reality of overturned tables, shattered goblets, and dark stains that would never fully wash from the ancient stones. But it was the silence that struck Lyra most forcefully as she sat in the healer's tent, her wounds tended and her strength slowly returning. The silence of a kingdom holding its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the chaos. Elder Thorne worked quietly beside her, documenting the evidence they had gathered throughout the night. The shattered pendant that had hidden her identity for 20 years lay in pieces on the wooden table, each fragment still glowing with residual magic. Beside it rested documents retrieved from General Aldrich's private chambers, papers that painted a picture of conspiracy and murder spanning 2 decades. "The poisoner's receipt," Thorne said quietly, indicating a yellowed parchment covered in careful script. "Hidden in Aldrich's personal strongbox, along with correspondence detailing the planned assassination of your parents. Enough evidence to satisfy even the most sceptical noble." Lyra studied the damning documents, her royal heritage allowing her to read the ancient script that many of the current nobility had forgotten. The casual cruelty detailed in those pages made her stomach clench with renewed fury, but also brought a strange sense of closure. Her parents' deaths had not been random tragedy, but calculated murder, and now the world would know the truth. "How many survived the battle?" she asked, her voice still rough from the previous night's exertion. Most of the nobles fled when the fighting began, but enough remained to witness Aldrich's confession. Word is already spreading throughout the castle and beyond. Thorne's weathered face creased with something that might have been satisfaction. "By noon, every person in the kingdom will know that the lost heir has returned and claimed justice for her murdered parents." A commotion outside the tent drew their attention. Lyra's enhanced senses caught the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple voices raised in urgent discussion, and beneath it all, the familiar presence that made her heart race despite her exhaustion. Kieran entered the tent with the contained energy of a caged wolf, his dark hair still dishevelled from the night's events, and his formal robes exchanged for practical leather and steel. Behind him came a handful of his most trusted advisers, their faces grave with the weight of unprecedented circumstances. "How is she?" Kieran asked without preamble, his eyes fixed on Lyra's face with an intensity that made the mate bond hum between them. "Healing," she answered before Thorne could respond, rising from her chair with careful grace. The wounds from her duel with Aldrich were closing rapidly, her awakened royal blood accelerating the process beyond normal human limits. "What news from the kingdom?" "Mixed," admitted Lord Chancellor Aldwyn, the same adviser who had counselled political necessity the night before. His attitude toward her had shifted dramatically, respect replacing dismissal as he inclined his head in formal acknowledgement. "The truth of your parentage and Aldrich's crimes is spreading quickly, but so are the implications of what happened." "Speak plainly," Lyra commanded, her voice carrying the authority that came as naturally as breathing, now that her heritage was no longer suppressed. "Lady Seraphina has fled the castle with her remaining supporters," Kieran said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But before she left, she sent messages to her family's allies throughout the southern duchies. She's claiming that you're an imposter, that the entire revelation was an elaborate deception designed to break the alliance and weaken the kingdom." Lyra had expected this. Seraphina was too intelligent to simply accept defeat, and too ambitious to abandon her claim to power without a fight. And how many believe her? "Enough to matter," Lord Aldwyn replied grimly. Duke Garrett of the South March has already declared his intention to march on the capital to restore legitimate rule. 3 other duchies have pledged support to what they're calling the true succession. They're going to use the alliance agreements, Kieran continued, moving to stand beside Lyra in a gesture of unity that was not lost on his advisers. Claim that my failure to honour the betrothal contract invalidates all existing treaties and justifies military intervention. The political implications were staggering. Lyra's return had not just exposed ancient crimes, but destabilised the entire network of alliances that held the kingdom together. Her victory over General Aldrich might prove Pyrrhic if it led to civil war and invasion. "There's more," Thorne said quietly, producing another set of documents from his collection. Aldrich's correspondence reveals that the Southern Alliance was never about protection from Northern raiders. The raids themselves were orchestrated by Aldrich's agents to justify the marriage alliance and consolidate power. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. If true, it meant that the entire political crisis had been manufactured, that the threats used to justify Seraphina's elevation were themselves part of the conspiracy. "The northern clans," Lyra breathed, understanding flooding through her. "The raids were blamed on them, but they were innocent. That's why the ancient treaties still hold force." "Indeed." Thorne's pale eyes glittered with something that might have been pride. "Your mother's bloodline carries more than just royal authority. It carries the loyalty of the mountain clans, the forest tribes, the northern settlements that have been unjustly accused for 20 years. Kieran's expression shifted as the full scope of the situation became clear. If the raids were false flag operations, if the northern clans are innocent, then the military support Seraphina offered was meaningless. Worse than meaningless, it was protection from a threat that didn't exist. "But the mountain clan's support is real," Lyra said, feeling truth settle in her bones with the weight of ancient oaths. "They were wrongly accused of crimes committed by my parents' murderers. That debt of honour will not go unpaid." Lord Aldwyn leaned forward, his expression cautiously hopeful. "You believe they will answer a call from the Northern Crown?" "I know they will." Lyra's hand moved to the silver circlet that rested on the table beside her, its metal warm with residual power. "The treaties signed by my mother included blood oaths that bind them to the defence of her line. They have been waiting 20 years to honour those obligations." "How can you be certain?" one of the other advisers asked. 20 years is a long time. Loyalties can shift, obligations can be forgotten." Lyra's response was to rise and walk to the tent's entrance, pushing aside the canvas flap to reveal the sight that had greeted dawn. Throughout the castle courtyard, the creatures she had tended for 3 years moved with purpose and intelligence that no one could deny. Shadowfang led a pack of dire wolves in coordinated patrols. Shadow bears worked alongside human guards to secure strategic positions. War panthers prowled the battlements with the efficiency of trained sentries. "Because they remember," she said simply, "the same way the beasts remember, the same way the magic remembers. Truth has a way of enduring, even when it's buried under decades of lies." As if summoned by her words, a distant horn call echoed across the valley beyond the castle walls. Then another, and another, until the morning air rang with the ancient signals of the northern clans. Kieran joined her at the tent entrance, his enhanced hearing picking up the sounds of approaching riders. "They're coming," he said, wonder creeping into his voice. "How did they know?" "The same way you knew to find me in the stable," Lyra replied, the mate bond pulsing warmly between them. "Some calls go deeper than conscious thought." The first riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the castle as the sun reached its zenith. They rode with the fluid grace of people born to the saddle, their weapons and armour bearing the distinctive craftsmanship of the mountain forges. Behind them came more and more, until the hillsides were alive with the movement of an army that had answered an ancient call to honour. At their head rode a figure that made Lyra's breath catch. Even at this distance, she could see the resemblance to her mother in the rider's bearing, the familiar cast of features that spoke of shared bloodline. Her mother's sister, she realised, the aunt she had never met but who had clearly never forgotten her obligations to family. "Lady Morwyn of the High Peaks," Elder Thorne said softly, joining them at the tent entrance. "Your mother's elder sister and war chief of the United Northern Clans. I sent word to her the moment your power awakened, but I never expected her to arrive so quickly." The approaching army was impressive, not just in size but in composition. Lyra could see the banners of a dozen different clans, groups that had historically struggled to cooperate, now united under a single cause. Her cause. "They're not just answering the call of the Northern Crown," she realised aloud. "They're answering the call of justice. 20 years of wrongful accusation, 20 years of bearing blame for crimes they didn't commit. They want vindication as much as they want to honour ancient oaths." Lord Aldwyn cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, this changes the political calculation significantly. If the Northern clans support your claim, if they can provide the military strength that Seraphina's alliance promised, then the Southern Duchies lose their primary justification for intervention." "More than that," Kieran added, his tactical mind already working through the implications. "If we can prove that the raids were orchestrated by Aldrich's people, we can turn Seraphina's own allies against her. No duke wants to discover he's been supporting the architects of his own people's suffering." Lyra nodded, feeling the pieces of a larger strategy beginning to fall into place. This was more than just reclaiming her personal throne or securing her mate bond with Kieran. This was about exposing decades of corruption, about restoring justice to an entire region that had been systematically deceived and manipulated. "Send envoys to the Southern Duchies," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to rule. "Offer them the evidence of Aldrich's deception. Give them the chance to abandon Seraphina's cause before they commit themselves to supporting criminals." "And if they refuse?" Lord Aldwyn asked. Lyra's smile was sharp as the blade that had taken General Aldrich's head. "Then they'll face the combined armies of the Northern Crown and the Mountain clans, fighting for justice rather than political convenience. I suspect they'll find the experience educational." The horn calls were closer now, and through the mate bond, she could feel Kieran's fierce pride in her tactical thinking. She was no longer the frightened servant who had hidden among the beasts, but she was also not the naive idealist who believed in victory without cost. She was a queen who understood both mercy and justice, and who would use whatever means necessary to protect her people. The war for her throne was entering a new phase, one where truth and ancient loyalty would be tested against modern political machination. But for the first time since this crisis began, Lyra felt confident in the outcome. After all, she had learned long ago that the most dangerous opponents were those who had nothing left to lose, and she had just given her enemies every reason to fear exactly that.